They were born into palaces but died on the scaffold. Princes, queens, and rebels, all tied by blood to the crown, all condemned by law. This is not a story of war, but of judgment, of family turned fatal, of how monarchy survives by devouring its own. From whispered plots to public beheadings, these aren't just executions, they're turning points. And the throne, it always watches. Welcome to the true cost of royalty. Every English royal execution explained. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe. These stories take time, and so does telling them right. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Night, morning, headphones on, or lights off. I want to know who's keeping watch with me. 1. Edmund of Woodstock, 1st Earl of Kent. There is a peculiar kind of silence that lingers over royal executions, the sort not born from the absence of noise, but from the loudness of consequence. In March of 1330, a scaffold was erected in Winchester, and upon it stood Edmund of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, son of Edward I, half-brother to Edward II, and uncle to Edward III. A Plantagenet prince dressed not in ceremonial robes but in the plain garments of a condemned man. His title was noble, his bloodline impeccable. And his crime? Hoping, perhaps too loudly, that his brother might still be alive. It was an execution that baffled as much as it horrified. Because Edmund wasn't a rebel. He wasn't ambitious. He wasn't trying to claim the crown or fracture the kingdom. In fact, he seemed to be doing the opposite. Trying to repair a royal fracture that had already exploded in civil war and deposition. But the machinery of power doesn't care much for nuance, especially not when that nuance might loosen the bolts holding a new regime together. The 1320s in England were not just politically unstable, they were tectonically unstable. The crown had passed from the deeply unpopular Edward II to his young son Edward III, but not by death nor abdication. Instead, by forced removal. A coup, with velvet gloves hiding iron fists. Orchestrated not by noble rebels or parliament, but by Edward II's own queen, Isabella of France, and her favorite comely, Roger Mortimer. When Edmund of Woodstock looked up in 1330 and tried to imagine the true sovereign of England, he didn't see a teenage Edward III or the calculating Mortimer. He saw his brother, Edward II, disgraced, deposed, possibly dead, but possibly not. That word, possibly, was all it took to end him. Edmund had always been the lesser-known brother. He didn't thirst for war or play the part of court villain. He was loyal to Edward II even when it cost him politically. When the tide turned in 1326 and Isabella and Mortimer invaded with foreign troops to remove Edward II, Edmund surrendered to the Queen's forces without a fight. He accepted the regime change. He even swore loyalty to the new boy king and his regents. But something festered after the dust of rebellion settled. Edward II's death, officially dated 1327 and attributed to mysterious causes at Berkeley Castle, didn't satisfy everyone. Whispers began to circulate that Edward hadn't died, that he had been smuggled abroad, that a body double had been buried in his place, that he lived in some forgotten tower or distant monastery. To the politically ambitious, these were dangerous fairy tales. But to the grieving, and to the dangerously loyal, they were a summons. Edmund was not the kind of man you'd expect to launch a conspiracy. He was no kingmaker. He didn't have an army. What he had was blood and belief. That was enough. When a monk told him that Edward II was alive and imprisoned in Corfe Castle, he believed it. When agents whispered about rescue missions, he listened. And when those whispers turned into plans, Edmund signed on. The trouble is, when you sign onto a rescue plot for a dead man, the state assumes one of two things. You're either delusional, or you're revealing the king isn't dead. Either way, you've just made treason fashionable again. The speed with which the machinery closed around Edmund was almost surreal. He wasn't dragged from a battlefield. He wasn't captured in disguise. He was simply arrested, put on trial in Parliament, because, of course, When you want a royal execution to feel properly legal, you use Parliament. And condemned. His crime? Compassing the king's death, meaning the young Edward III, by allegedly trying to overthrow him in favor of the possibly alive Edward II. And that was the trick. Even suggesting that Edward II was alive was, by implication, declaring Edward III a usurper. And if you called the king a usurper, even by accident, you'd committed treason. But the sentencing wasn't clean. The political optics weren't good. This wasn't a foreign spy or a rebel warlord. This was the king's uncle, a Plantagenet, one of their own. There's a legend that when the execution day came, no one wanted to do the job. The executioner, reportedly, fled. The city officials refused. Eventually, a convict was offered his life in exchange for lifting the axe. Whether true or not, the imagery has stuck. A prince of the realm kneeling on a scaffold in Winchester, surrounded by onlookers paralyzed not by pity, but by sheer political vertigo. This was not justice. This was an object lesson, and nobody wanted their fingerprints on it. The axe fell on March 19, 1330. Edmund's head rolled into history, but not cleanly. What happened next would make any conspiracy theorist twitch with satisfaction. Because just 7 months after Edmund's death, Edward III staged his own coup against Mortimer, arresting him in the night and having him executed. Isabella was placed under house arrest. The regency was over. The boy king had grown teeth and a memory. That reversal only magnified Edmund's tragedy. In hindsight, it looked less like treason and more like a badly timed loyalty. He hadn't been a danger to Edward III. He'd been a pawn, manipulated by court politics, fed misinformation, and punished for a threat that probably never existed. But in the logic of political power, probably doesn't help you. Especially not in a world where loyalty is fluid and paranoia is policy. For years, Edmund's death echoed in the halls of English memory. He became a kind of martyr, not for a cause, but for being too closely tied to the wrong version of the truth. His son would be restored in title. His family would rise again. But the message was clear. Royalty was not a suit of armor. It was a target. And even those with the purest blood could bleed for asking the wrong questions. The scaffolding in Winchester didn't just host an execution, it inaugurated a pattern. Because the 14 names that follow, they too would bleed under banners of treason and loyalty, legitimacy and lineage. And like Edmund, many of them would die not for what they did, but for what they represented. But perhaps the most unnerving detail isn't how or why Edmund died. It's that he might have been right. In 1330, a letter surfaced in Europe claiming to be from Edward II, alive, living as a hermit beyond England's reach. Most historians dismiss it as a hoax. But what if it wasn't? What if Edmund died not for chasing a fantasy, but for getting too close to a secret that the crown couldn't afford to explain? It wouldn't be the last time that royal blood and royal secrets collided. Because just under a century later, another royal cousin, another Plantagenet, would face the axe. This one, caught in the gears of a plot to replace a king whose rule was barely secure. His crime wasn't loyalty, it was ambition, or so they said. But unlike Edmund, Richard of Königsberg would be remembered not as a victim of loyalty, but as a warning that even whispers of claim could cost you your head, especially if they came just days before a king set sail for war. 2. Richard of Königsberg, 3rd Earl of Cambridge. You can tell a lot about a royal execution by the season it's carried out in. Spring is for cleaning house. Autumn is for severing loose ends. And summer? Summer is for reminders, delivered not by parchment or proclamation, but by spectacle. On August 5th, 1415, in the bustling port city of Southampton, just as the English army was mustering to invade France, a scaffold was raised. A nobleman was escorted to the block. His name was Richard of Königsberg, 3rd Earl of Cambridge. You've probably never heard of him, but you've almost certainly heard of what he set in motion. Richard was a small figure in the grand chessboard of royal blood, until the moment he wasn't. He was the second son of Edmund of Langley, 1st Duke of York, himself a son of Edward III, which made Richard a Plantagenet by birth, a York by designation, and, importantly, a cousin to the crown. Not a first-tier royal, not a ruling prince, but close enough to matter when things got unstable. And in the early 15th century, everything was unstable. Henry V, young, pious, and already war-tempered, had only just inherited the throne after his father's death in 1413. The Lancastrian dynasty was still freshly stitched into the English monarchy, and its legitimacy wasn't bulletproof. Henry IV, Henry V's father, had seized the crown from Richard II in 1399, a neat bit of royal reorganization that had set in motion a long chain of claims, counterclaims, and discontent. Richard of Königsberg stood close enough to this mess to be dangerous. Though his elder brother held the family title of York, it was Richard who married smart. His wife, Anne Mortimer, was a direct descendant of Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second surviving son, one rung closer to the main Plantagenet line than the Lancastrian branch. Through that marriage, Richard gained something much more potent than land: a claim. You'd be forgiven for thinking Richard plotted to seize the throne for himself. He didn't. He lacked the resources, the clout, and honestly, the charisma. But what he did have was a plan. Or rather, he backed one. In the summer of 1415, as Henry V prepared his now famous campaign to claim the French crown, a group of conspirators, Richard of Königsberg, Henry Scrope, and Sir Thomas Grey, were hatching a plot. Its purpose? Remove Henry V and elevate a rival heir, Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March. The plan, later called the Southampton Plot, was riddled with amateur hour mistakes, vague timelines, overconfidence, and the fatal assumption that a monarchy bracing for war wouldn't also be bracing for treachery. The irony, of course, is that Edmund Mortimer himself betrayed the plot. History loves a clean arc, but real conspiracies rarely oblige. Mortimer, whether out of loyalty, fear, or good political sense, informed Henry V of the plot before it could even stretch its legs. The arrests were swift. No swords drawn, no dramatic final stands, just a paper trail, a whisper campaign, and a gallows quickly built by the sea. Richard was tried in Southampton on the very doorstep of the fleet that Henry was assembling to invade France. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Here, before the king and his court, the conspirators were arraigned not just for treason, but for endangering the destiny of England. That's the thing about royal justice. It tends to appear most decisively when a distraction is least welcome. And what better distraction than a potential civil war on the eve of a foreign campaign? Richard's trial, such as it was, proceeded with the mechanical swiftness typical of treason cases in wartime. He confessed, not out of cowardice, but perhaps out of calculation, or defeat. Scrope, far better connected, tried to plead that his involvement was merely as a double agent, feeding information to the king all along. Grey denied everything. None of it mattered. The executions were set for the next day. Grey was the warm-up act, executed first on August 2nd. Richard and Scrope followed on August 5th, with Henry himself reportedly attending. Again, the performance was deliberate. Henry needed unity, not infighting, so he used a blade where a pardon might have invited further doubt. But here's where things grow strange. Because Richard of Königsberg, a minor earl with a minor rebellion, should have disappeared into the footnotes of royal history. But he didn't, because he had a son. His name was Richard Plantagenet, later Duke of York. And he, in turn, would father Edward IV and Richard III. The Wars of the Roses, one of the most bloody, tangled, and destabilizing civil wars in English history, wasn't just about Lancasters and Yorks. It was about this moment, about the execution of a man whose descendants would decide to cash in the claim he once barely dared whisper aloud. There's a cruel irony here. Henry V, the heroic king of Agincourt, might be remembered as one of England's great warrior kings. But his sword cut down a man whose bloodline would, in time, erase all that glory. The Yorkist dynasty, built from the claim Richard of Konigsberg carried into the grave, would eventually rip the crown from Lancastrian hands. And yet in 1415, no one was thinking about dynastic revenge. They were thinking about France, about banners and boats and the war to come. Richard's execution was seen less as a tragedy than as a practical necessity. It wasn't Shakespearean. It was bureaucratic. A legal cleaning of the slate before embarking on destiny. Still, not everyone agreed. Years later, during the Yorkist ascendancy, Parliament would revisit Richard's case. They declared his execution unlawful, his conviction procedurally irregular, and his honor posthumously restored. These reversals weren't about justice. They were about legitimacy. Edward IV, Richard's grandson, was now on the throne, and history needed to be rewritten to make it look like destiny. In other words, the axe had been premature. So what kind of man was Richard really? Not a visionary, not a revolutionary, not a martyr. He was, more than anything, a node. A branch on a tree the crown hadn't yet noticed was growing in the wrong direction. His crime was essentially genealogical. His execution was less about his plans than about his potential. The state was reacting not to who he was, but to who he could become, or worse, who his children could become. That's the unease at the heart of royal blood. It creates more problems than it solves. It gives you prestige, yes, but it also makes your existence a permanent threat. You can't renounce your ancestry. You can't unbirth yourself. So all it takes is a king having a bad year, and suddenly your dinner party looks like a conspiracy. And Richard's conspiracy, if it can even be called that, wasn't elegant or precise. It was desperate. It was rushed. It was based on the delusion that legitimacy could trump preparation, that genealogy could overthrow reality, and that an army marching for France would pause long enough to fall apart over a pamphlet and a family tree. It didn't. But history remembered the name. Not Richard's name, perhaps, but the name of his house, the House of York. His son would inherit not just his blood, but his unfinished business. And from that seed would sprout decades of civil war, legal wrangling, fratricide, and the death of entire lines. All because one man believed a cousin should be king. So what does Richard's execution tell us? That royal blood is only an asset when someone else needs it. That claims to the throne are like live wires. They sit silently until touched. And most of all, that the most dangerous kind of rebel is the one who thinks they're fixing history rather than breaking it. But we're not done with this pattern, not even close. Because before the Wars of the Roses erupted, and before the Plantagenet dream began eating itself from within, there would be another nobleman, another cousin, another decapitated line, a duke this time, not of Cambridge, but of Buckingham. A man who, unlike Richard, would play both sides of a royal crisis before losing his head for backing the wrong one at the wrong moment. He wouldn't die in a port city or on the eve of a foreign war. No, his execution would happen inland, in the fog of an uncertain regime, where loyalty flipped like a coin and the crown itself seemed cursed. A man who helped make a king, and then tried to break him. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. So go ahead, hit subscribe. These stories only get stranger from here. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in London? 3 a.m. in Ohio? I want to know who else is still awake, chasing ghosts with me. 3. Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham. If Richard of Konigsberg died for believing in a claim, Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, died for believing he could survive changing his mind. His execution in 1483 did not come at the dawn of a great war, nor at the collapse of a dynasty, but in that far more dangerous moment, the chaotic pause between certainty and catastrophe. The kind of moment where everyone thinks the game is still being negotiated, right up until someone brings out the axe. Buckingham was not a marginal cousin or a genealogical footnote. He was royal blood with footnotes attached. Descended from Edward III through multiple lines, connected by ancestry to both Lancastrian and Yorkist claims, and absurdly wealthy even by noble standards. If royal blood were currency, Buckingham was walking around with pockets full of it, jingling loudly in a kingdom that had grown increasingly sensitive to the sound. And yet, for most of his life, he seemed to understand the rules. He knew when to kneel. He knew when to wait. He knew when to smile politely and say nothing while history rearranged itself around him. During the reign of Edward IV, he stayed loyal, enjoyed royal favor, and kept his head firmly attached to his body. Always a wise long-term strategy. Then Edward IV died. What followed in 1483 was not simply a succession crisis. It was a vacuum, a sudden, gaping absence of authority, into which every ambition, fear, and half-buried grievance rushed at once. Edward's heir, Edward V, was a boy. His brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was a seasoned power broker with an army and a reputation for decisiveness. And Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, stood between them, smiling, nodding, calculating. At first, Buckingham chose Richard. This was not irrational. Richard of Gloucester moved quickly, declaring himself Lord Protector, sidelining the Woodville family, and presenting himself as the stabilizing adult in a kingdom tired of regencies and factional bloodshed. Buckingham helped him. He stood beside Richard publicly. He lent his name, his influence, and, crucially, his bloodline, to Richard's claim that he was acting not out of ambition, but necessity. When Richard made the leap from protector to king, declaring Edward IV's children illegitimate and crowning himself Richard III, Buckingham was still there, still supportive, still rewarded. He was granted offices, lands, and authority. For a brief, glittering moment, it looked like he'd chosen correctly. And then something shifted. Historians argue endlessly about what that something was. Was Buckingham denied lands he believed were promised? Did he realize that Richard's regime was wobbling under suspicion and popular unease? Did he begin to see himself, not Richard, as the man best positioned to restore legitimacy? Or did the disappearance of the young princes from public view spark a moral recoil he couldn't ignore? The truth is probably less cinematic and more damning. Buckingham wanted more. And Richard, newly crowned and acutely paranoid, was not inclined to share. By autumn of 1483, Buckingham had turned. He didn't do it quietly. He didn't do it cleverly. He did it in the most dangerous way possible, by associating himself with a rebellion that had no clear leader, no unified strategy, and no guarantee of success. A rebellion that later historians would simplistically label Buckingham's Rebellion, even though its coordination was so poor that storms, miscommunication, and sheer incompetence unraveled it before it truly began. This was not a masterstroke. It was a gamble fueled by bloodline confidence, the belief that royal ancestry itself could generate momentum. Richard III responded exactly as a king who had seized the throne under dubious circumstances would respond, swiftly, decisively, and without mercy. Buckingham's rebellion collapsed almost immediately. His forces failed to gather. His allies failed to arrive. Flooded rivers prevented movement. The kingdom did not rise up in his name. Instead, it shrugged, watched, and waited to see who would survive. Buckingham fled, not abroad, not to sanctuary, but into the countryside, disguised, desperate, and betrayed by the very social order that once propped him up. He was captured not by knights or royal agents, but by a retainer who handed him over for reward. A duke reduced to currency. Richard wasted no time. There would be no extended trial, no careful peer deliberations, no theatrical defense. Buckingham was condemned for treason and executed at Salisbury on the 2nd of November 1483. His immense wealth was forfeit, his titles extinguished, his body buried without ceremony. And just like that, one of the most powerful noblemen in England was erased. But the real significance of Buckingham's death lies not in his rebellion, but in its timing. This was the first major execution carried out by Richard III after taking the throne, and it sent a message that echoed far beyond Salisbury. Loyalty was conditional, reversible, and fatal if miscalculated. Richard had eliminated a man who had helped make him king. That fact alone poisoned the well of trust around his reign. Because if a king will execute his closest ally, who is safe? Buckingham's death also exposed something uncomfortable about late medieval kingship, that blood no longer guaranteed security. In earlier centuries, royal cousins were dangerous, but they were also protected by custom, hesitation, and fear of precedent. By 1483, those restraints were fraying. The crown had learned that eliminating threats early was cheaper than dealing with them later. Buckingham misread that evolution. He believed the old rules still applied, that a duke with royal blood could challenge, negotiate, retreat, and survive. Instead, he discovered the new reality. The monarchy had become transactional, useful today, disposable tomorrow. And there is a darker irony still, because Buckingham's execution did not stabilize Richard III's reign. It destabilized it further. Nobles watched a duke fall and quietly recalculated their loyalties. Support softened. Confidence evaporated. Richard's rule began to feel less like restoration and more like occupation. 2 years later, at Bosworth Field, Richard III would die, his crown rolling into the hands of Henry Tudor. Buckingham never lived to see that reversal, but his blood marked the road toward it. He was not a tragic innocent. He was not a misunderstood idealist. He was a political weather vane who believed he could pivot faster than the storm. He underestimated how quickly kings learn to fear the people who know their weaknesses best. And in that sense, Buckingham's execution is a hinge point. It belongs to the Wars of the Roses not as a battle, but as a warning. The age of negotiating with royal blood was ending. The age of extinguishing it had begun. Which brings us to the next man on our list, a man whose blood was even closer to the throne, whose execution was even more shocking, and whose death would become so wrapped in rumor that history itself would start embellishing it. A brother executed by a brother. A prince condemned not by rebellion, but by Parliament itself. And a story so strange that centuries later, people would insist he died not by the blade, but by drowning in wine. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. 4. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. When the crown becomes a revolving door, sooner or later it eats its own. And in the Wars of the Roses, the most dangerous job in England wasn't king. It was the king's brother. Enter George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. Not a pawn, not a distant cousin, not a courtier who flew too close to power. Clarence was power, a Plantagenet prince in full bloom, brother to Edward IV, brother to Richard III, son of Richard, Duke of York, the man who'd once staked a claim to the throne with such thunderous conviction that it shattered the country in two. George had the name, the pedigree, the wealth, the ambition, and the tragic misfortune of being born second. And in England's 15th century royal ecosystem, being the second son meant living in a pressure cooker. Close enough to touch the crown, too far to ever wear it. Destined to live in the shadows of kings, yet never quite content to stay there. George's downfall wasn't a single act of treason or one catastrophic mistake. It was a long, roiling descent into self-destruction, paranoia, and fatal entitlement. But to understand why a king had his own brother executed in 1478, we have to go back further, into the chaotic theater of civil war, shifting allegiances, and sibling rivalry that made the Wars of the Roses less of a dynastic dispute and more of a national identity crisis. Clarence was born in 1449 into a family on the rise and under siege. His father, the powerful Duke of York, had pressed his claim to the throne during the reign of the mentally fragile Henry VI. That challenge sparked decades of bloody warfare between the Yorks and the Lancastrians, two branches of the Plantagenet family tree that had grown too wide for one crown to contain. By 1461, George's older brother Edward had seized the throne, becoming Edward IV, the first Yorkist king of England. George was just 12 when it happened, old enough to understand power, young enough to believe that blood would always protect him. And for a while, it did. Edward made George Duke of Clarence, showered him with wealth and lands, and placed him among the realm's highest nobility. He was young, golden-haired, tall, charming. He moved through court with the easy arrogance of someone who never had to learn humility. But George wanted more than favor. He wanted agency. And that's when he made the first of several fatal errors. He aligned himself with Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker. Warwick was the kind of man who didn't just influence power. He manufactured it. He had helped Edward IV win the crown, only to become disillusioned when Edward married the wrong woman. Elizabeth Woodville, a widow with no foreign alliance, no great dowry, and far too many hungry relatives. Warwick, furious that his plans had been sidelined, began plotting. And George? He saw an opening. In 1469, he married Warwick's daughter, Isabel Neville, without Edward IV's permission. That alone was a challenge to royal authority. But it got worse. Clarence then joined Warwick in open rebellion against the king. Their plan was bold, if reckless. Depose Edward, restore Henry VI, temporarily, and reshape the throne around their own ambitions. It failed. Not immediately. For a brief time, Warwick actually did restore Henry VI to the throne, but it was a paper regime, unstable, unpopular, and dependent on military luck. Edward IV regained control in 1471, Henry VI was captured, and Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet. And Clarence? He begged forgiveness. Astonishingly, Edward granted it. The bond of brotherhood was not so easily broken, yet. Clarence was restored to royal favor, his titles returned, and he resumed his place at court. But something had changed. Trust, once broken, never fully mended. Clarence had revealed himself to be ambitious. And in a world where ambition was treason in embryo, that made him dangerous. Still, the bloodline was thick. Edward let it go. For a time. But the cracks deepened. Clarence began feuding with the Woodville family, especially Queen Elizabeth and her relatives. They saw Clarence as a threat. He saw them as grasping upstarts. The court split into factions. Gossip flowed like wine. Then tragedy struck. In 1476, Clarence's wife Isabel died suddenly, shortly after childbirth. Grief alone might not have doomed him, but what he did next might as well have been treason in waiting. He accused one of her attendants, Anchoret Twentyho, of murdering Isabel by poison. Without royal permission, Clarence held a private trial, secured a guilty verdict, and had her executed. It was a staggering breach of royal authority. Clarence had acted like a king within his own household, not just grieving, but governing, executing subjects outside the king's justice. Edward was livid. He summoned Clarence to court. And from there, things spiraled into absurdity. Clarence began openly accusing the Queen's relatives of conspiring against him. He claimed his own enemies were poisoning his wine. He publicly read a document that questioned Edward's legitimacy as king. Parliament was now watching. And so was Edward's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III, who, unlike Clarence, had mastered the art of loyalty. By January 1478, the crown had had enough. Parliament passed a bill of attainder against George Plantagenet, a legal declaration that he was guilty of treason, stripping him of titles, lands, and protections without a trial. The specific charges were murky, as charges often are when the real reason is political. They included disseminating rumors about the king, undermining royal authority, and privately administering justice. In short, Clarence had begun to behave like a rival monarch. His execution was ordered. On February 18, 1478, George Plantagenet was put to death within the Tower of London. The manner of his death was deliberately private, and that privacy created a vacuum into which legend rushed like air into a bell jar. The most famous version of the story, repeated for centuries, is that Clarence was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Some took it literally, imagining a bizarre execution by indulgence. Others saw it as metaphor, or satire, or propaganda. The truth? Almost certainly not wine. More likely a beheading. Quiet, efficient. The kind of death you give to someone you once loved and now need to forget. But the why of his death still looms larger than the how. Clarence wasn't executed for leading armies against the king. That had already happened and been forgiven. He wasn't executed for marriage alliances, for speaking out of turn, or even for insubordination. He was executed because he refused to understand that the game had changed. In the early days of the Wars of the Roses, bloodline had been a shield. Princes rebelled and were forgiven because blood still meant something. But by 1478, the chaos of shifting loyalties, pretenders, and proxy rulers had turned royal blood into a liability. Clarence had proven that he couldn't be trusted to stay in line, and Edward IV, once his protector, had decided that the only safe way to rule was to remove the threats inside the house. His death wasn't justice, it was administration. And yet Clarence wasn't the end of the line. He left behind 2 children. One, Margaret Pole, would live long enough to become Countess of Salisbury and face her own acts under Henry VIII. The other, Edward Plantagenet, 17th Earl of Warwick, would become the final echo of the Yorkist claim. A boy imprisoned from childhood, a pawn in the balance between Tudor stability and Plantagenet nostalgia, and in time, yet another royal cousin who would lose his head. Because Clarence's execution was not a coda, it was a foreshadowing. It revealed that even in victory, the Yorks were tearing themselves apart. That blood, once so potent, now poisoned everything it touched. And Edward IV? He didn't live long after executing his brother. He died suddenly in 1483, leaving the crown to a 12-year-old boy, Edward V, who would vanish into legend as one of the princes in the Tower. The death of Clarence had not brought peace. It had only cleared a space for something even darker to emerge. And the son he left behind? Edward of Warwick, still a child, would become a haunting symbol of what happened when a bloodline outlived its usefulness. Because under the Tudors, there would be no space for nostalgia, no room for rival claims, no appetite for princes whose names reminded the kingdom of alternative endings. And in 1499, that boy, grown but never free, would meet his own executioner. This time the charge would be treason. But the real crime? Heirship. 5. Edward Plantagenet, 17th Earl of Warwick. By the end of the 15th century, England was a country haunted by ghosts it had created for itself. The Wars of the Roses hadn't just ended in battlefield corpses and rewritten family trees. It had left behind a sprawling graveyard of forgotten heirs, sidelined bloodlines, and children born under dynasties already dead. Among them stood Edward Plantagenet, 17th Earl of Warwick, the last legitimate male of the Yorkist line. The final flickering ember of a royal family that had once ruled England, and had, in turn, been ruled by its own fatalism. He was executed on the 28th of November 1499, beheaded on Tower Hill in the cold wind of a Tudor regime that wanted to be modern, unchallenged, and above all, uncontested. But Warwick was no rebel. He didn't command armies. He hadn't written manifestos or declared open war. For most of his life, he hadn't even seen the outside world. His crime, if it could be called that, was simply this: being born with the wrong surname. To understand why that mattered, why a boy imprisoned at age 10 could be condemned as a threat at age 24, we need to return to the collapsing architecture of Yorkist power. Warwick's father was George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother to King Edward IV and King Richard III. Clarence had been executed in 1478, possibly drowned in Malmsey wine, possibly just beheaded, definitely out of royal patience. At the time of his father's death, Edward of Warwick was only 3 years old. His future was already curdled with danger. He was the nephew of 2 kings, the son of a traitor, and the bearer of a name that had begun to ring more like a death sentence than a birthright. For all his youth and innocence, he stood on a cliff edge, a symbolic presence in a country still recovering from decades of civil war. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in 1483, the power vacuum was immediate and violent. Richard III, Warwick's uncle, seized the throne. The young Edward V disappeared. The Wars of the Roses were no longer a feud. They had become a blueprint for how to replace a monarch without apology. And young Edward of Warwick? He was allowed, at least briefly, to stay within the Yorkist household. Not quite a prince, not quite a prisoner. A question mark in a castle. That all changed in 1485. Bosworth Field. Richard III slain. The crown taken by Henry Tudor, who styled himself Henry VII, merging his marginal Lancastrian claim with the spoils of conquest. With Richard's death, the Plantagenet line was officially out of power, but not, crucially, out of existence. Henry VII was no fool. He knew exactly how tenuous his hold on the throne was. He had taken it by force, not birth. His claim was murky, stitched together through his mother's Beaufort line, a family descended from John of Gaunt, but once declared illegitimate. To solidify his regime, Henry married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. In theory, this united the warring houses. In practice, it merely added more Yorkist claimants to his family tree. And of all the remaining Yorkists, none were more threatening, at least on parchment, than Edward of Warwick. By 1485, Warwick was only 10. Still, the new Tudor regime moved fast. Henry had him arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he would remain for the next 14 years. Not tried, not sentenced, not charged, just stored, like a dangerous relic that couldn't be destroyed, but also couldn't be allowed to circulate freely. The Tower, by then, was less a fortress and more a political oubliette. Warwick became its quietest prisoner, tucked away, rarely seen, and reportedly so cloistered that he later struggled with basic language and social interaction. It's said he was never properly educated, never allowed access to tutors or courtiers, and never permitted to leave. A prince without a kingdom, a noble without a court, and eventually a man without a voice. But why? Keep him alive? Because the Tudors weren't yet ready to rewrite the rules entirely. Executing a boy for existing might have looked too medieval, even for a world that had just cut down a king on a battlefield. So instead, they tried containment. They built a regime that denied him not just freedom, but relevance. It worked, until it didn't. In 1490s England, peace was as fragile as parchment in the rain. The throne was still considered new, its claims still debated. And with every bad harvest, every unpopular tax, every rumor of unrest, that peace became more brittle. Enter Perkin Warbeck. In 1491, a young man appeared in Burgundy claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the missing princes in the Tower. Whether he truly believed it or was simply used as a pawn by foreign powers, Warbeck's claim electrified opposition to Henry VII. Yorkist sympathizers rallied. European courts backed him. Rebellions simmered. And suddenly Warwick, the real Warwick, silent in the "This so we mean" Tower, became part of the conversation again. Why? Because Warbeck's story worked better with Warwick alive. With a true heir still imprisoned, Warbeck's claim gained credibility. Conspirators believed that freeing Warwick and installing him alongside, or instead of, Warbeck could create a united Yorkist front. In 1499, Warwick was finally implicated in one such plot. Accounts vary wildly on the specifics. Some say he tried to escape. Others claim he and Warbeck communicated inside the tower, conspiring together. Some suggest the entire conspiracy was invented, or at least encouraged, by Tudor agents as a pretext to resolve the lingering Warwick problem once and for all. What we do know is this. In November 1499, after years of silence, Warwick was finally brought to trial for treason. The evidence? Thin. The politics? Heavy. He was found guilty and executed by beheading. A royal execution cloaked in legality but rooted in fear. For Henry VII, the timing was strategic. He was negotiating the marriage of his son, Prince Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. The Spanish royal family reportedly insisted that Henry resolve dynastic threats before any union could proceed. In this context, Warwick was not just a threat. He was a liability in a marriage contract. So he was removed. Cleanly. Quietly. And, most of all, belatedly. And here the story should end. But it doesn't. Because Warwick's death was not only the execution of a man, it was the execution of a possibility, a timeline, a royal house. With his beheading, the male line of the House of York was extinguished. The Wars of the Roses, once fueled by competing branches of the Plantagenet tree, finally ran out of heirs to prop up as figureheads. The Tudors had trimmed the last leaf. But what's disturbing isn't that it happened. It's how unnecessary it may have been. Warwick was by all reports mentally diminished by his years in isolation. Some contemporaries described him as confused, unable to understand basic court proceedings, incapable of speech in public. He was not a political mastermind. He wasn't rallying troops. He wasn't forging alliances. He was a symbol. And that was enough. Because regimes don't execute threats. They execute symbols. And Warwick, silent, powerless, and barely visible, was the loudest symbol of all. He reminded the country that there had once been a royal family before the Tudors, one that hadn't come from Wales or seized its crown with French gold, one that had ruled for generations. His death marked a turning point. After 1499, there would be no more royal executions from the Yorkist cause. The Tudors had successfully erased their dynastic competitors. What followed was not peace, but dominance and repression. Warwick became a cautionary tale for royal bastards, distant cousins, and inconvenient nephews. Keep your head down. Don't be born too close to power. Don't carry a surname that makes people nervous, because history remembers kings and quietly disposes of their rivals. Even so, the ghost of Warwick lingered. His cousin, Margaret Pole, would eventually be executed under Henry VIII decades later. Not for rebellion, but for remembering too well, for existing too long, for reminding everyone that royal blood, once spilled, tends to leave stains. And Henry VII? His dynasty would rule for a century, but not without its own cracks. His son, Henry VIII, would revive the use of attainder and execution with brutal frequency. His granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would eventually face her own cousin in a deadly struggle for legitimacy. But those are stories for later. For now, in the year 1499, the scaffold stands quiet. The axe is still. The bloodline of York lies buried. And somewhere in the silence, a new message takes hold. In the England of kings, the most dangerous thing you can be is an heir without a throne, because the Tudors may have ended the war, but they did not end the habit. And the next royal to face execution? He wouldn't be a child or a prisoner. He would be a man of immense power, A cousin of the king, the Duke of Buckingham, version 2. A noble so well connected, so spectacularly pedigreed, that even whispers of treason could crack the kingdom in half. And crack it they would. 6. Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham. By the time Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham, was led to the scaffold on 17th May 1521, the England he looked out upon was no longer the blood-slick chaos of the Wars of the Roses. The dynasties had settled, the Tudors had conquered, the red and white roses had wilted into political branding. But beneath the surface calm of this newly stable realm, something darker had taken root, a regime that no longer fought for its legitimacy, but one that manufactured it, ruthlessly, methodically, and with a smile. The execution of Edward Stafford wasn't just about alleged treason, it was about a king who was beginning to believe that he was the state. And as the Tudor monarchy grew stronger, the room for ancestral pride, aristocratic autonomy, and the old rules of noble privilege began to shrink. The axe no longer needed a rebellion to fall, it only needed a prophecy. But let's back up, because Buckingham didn't begin as a threat. He began as the embodiment of Tudor loyalty. Born in 1478 during the dying breaths of Yorkist rule, Edward Stafford inherited his title at just 5 years old when his father, the 2nd Duke of Buckingham, was executed by Richard III after backing the wrong claimant during the last spasms of dynastic chaos. But fate, if that word even means anything in a world ruled by politics, offered Edward a kind of redemption. When Henry VII took the crown in 1485, he restored young Edward's inheritance. Not just the title, but the wealth, the prestige, the full aristocratic toolkit. This was not done out of sentimentality, it was a calculation. The new Tudor regime, freshly seated and precariously balanced, needed the appearance of continuity. Restoring a Yorkist duke, especially one descended from Edward III, was a PR maneuver, a way to soothe the old nobility and make them believe that the Tudors were not just conquerors, but custodians of tradition. So Edward Stafford grew up at court. He was knighted at Henry VII's coronation. He served with distinction. He married well. He played the game exactly as expected. And when Henry VII died in 1509 and the 18-year-old Henry VIII took the throne, Buckingham seemed perfectly positioned to remain in the sun. But that's the thing about sunshine in Tudor England. It always hides a storm. Henry VIII was not yet the bloated tyrant of later memory. In 1521, he was still youthful, still handsome, still basking in the early glamour of his kingship. But even then, the cracks were showing. His obsession with heirs, his growing paranoia, his hypersensitivity to threats both real and imagined, and hovering always in the background, his anxiety about the Tudor claim itself. The Tudors, for all their pomp, still knew their roots were shallow. They were descended from a legitimized bastard line, propped up by marriage and military victory, not divine right. So the existence of noblemen like Buckingham, with their long Plantagenet pedigrees and massive landholdings, was a constant threat, whether or not it ever rose to rebellion. And Buckingham? He didn't hide his lineage. He flaunted it. He claimed descent from Thomas of Woodstock, youngest son of Edward III. Through both his father and mother he could trace bloodlines to royalty. He even wore his ancestral pride like armor, reportedly reminding others that if the Tudor line failed, he had the next best claim. He built a lavish household, surrounded himself with retainers, allowed talk, idle or not, of omens, dreams, and future kings. And that, in the court of Henry VIII, was a mistake of fatal proportions. In the spring of 1521, Buckingham was suddenly arrested. There was no great rebellion, no armies, no letters to foreign powers. Just talk, gossip, prophecy. A few servants who claimed he had entertained ideas about the throne. A comment overheard, a prediction repeated, maybe a dream, maybe a drunken word. But under Henry VIII's reign, even thoughts could be treason, especially if they came from someone who had the means to act on them. He was tried by his peers, a formal process that gave the appearance of legality. But the outcome was already written. The witnesses were mostly servants, terrified or bribed. The charges vague, the king's will unmistakable. On 13th May 1521, the Duke was convicted of high treason. He was executed 4 days later. The method? Beheading. The place? Tower Hill, London. A site already seasoned with the blood of royals and would-be kings. The reaction? Shock, but not surprise. Because by now the kingdom had begun to learn that anyone could fall. That favor was not protection. That titles, bloodlines, and history were all paper shields against a monarch with a sharpened sense of his own insecurity. But what makes Buckingham's case so chilling isn't just the ease with which the trial unfolded, it's the thinness of the cause. There were no letters, no swords, no alliances, just whispers, and the whispers were enough. Because by 1521, England had entered a new phase in its political evolution. The Wars of the Roses had shown what happened when claimants acted. The Tudors, in response, began punishing claimants for merely existing. The sin was no longer rebellion, it was potential. Buckingham was potential incarnate, a walking reminder that the Plantagenets hadn't vanished, that the past still had a pulse, that the crown could one day sit on a different head. That idea, more than any sword, threatened the mythology Henry VIII was building for himself. So the axe fell. And with it, another noble house was decapitated, literally and symbolically. But there's a deeper irony here. Because even as Henry executed Buckingham for entertaining thoughts of succession, his own court was beginning to tremble under the weight of succession anxiety. By the early 1520s, Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced only one surviving child, Mary. No son, no male heir, and the king's obsession with dynastic continuity, already sharp, was becoming an open wound. So Buckingham's execution wasn't just a crackdown, it was a performance. A way to say, this throne is not up for grabs. The idea that anyone might speculate about replacing the Tudors, whether through prophecy, blood, or whispers, was now officially a capital offense. The political message was clear. Your pedigree is not your destiny. But if that were true, why was Henry still so afraid? Because deep down, he knew the danger hadn't passed. The court still teemed with old bloodlines. Noble families still intermarried, still traced their lineage to Edward III, still whispered their grievances when the wine ran out. Executing Buckingham didn't end that threat. It simply made it quieter. And in that quiet, a different kind of danger began to grow. Because while Henry was busy beheading noblemen and reorganizing his court, he was also sliding into the most explosive royal drama of his reign, his marriage crisis. And the next royal to face the executioner's block would not be a duke, or a cousin, or a distant claimant. It would be his queen, a woman who had risen from lady-in-waiting to queen consort, who had given him a daughter when he wanted a son, who had once been the embodiment of his ambition, and who, in time, became the most famous royal victim of all. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and her execution would make the entire kingdom pause because it wasn't just the death of a queen. It was the moment England learned that not even the crown on your head could save you. 7. Anne Boleyn. In the end, Anne Boleyn didn't die because she betrayed the king. She died because she failed to deliver a miracle. And because the man who once risked a kingdom to marry her decided that miracles were non-negotiable. Her execution, carried out on May 19, 1536 within the walls of the Tower of London, stands as one of the most mythologized royal deaths in English history. Unlike the dukes and cousins before her, Anne was no distant claimant or quietly threatening bloodline. She was a queen, a crowned, consecrated, reigning Queen of England, cut down not for a political coup, but for the inconvenience of her womb. Anne was born around 1501 into a family that was noble, but not royal. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, had clawed his way into favor under Henry VII and then Henry VIII through diplomacy, service, and marriage alliances. Anne's education was cosmopolitan. She grew up at the glittering courts of the Netherlands and France, learning refinement, courtly manners, and a sharp political instinct sharpened by observation. She was not destined to be queen, but she was destined to matter. She returned to England around 1522, and by the mid-1520s she had caught the king's eye, not as a mistress, but as a mystery. Henry was still married to Catherine of Aragon, his Spanish queen and the widow of his elder brother, Arthur. That marriage, though politically useful at first, had soured under the weight of childlessness. Of their many children, only Princess Mary had survived. No son, no heir, no security. Henry was growing desperate. Enter Anne. She wasn't the classic beauty of legend, at least, not in the way Tudor courtiers liked to pretend. Her appeal was presence, wit, intelligence, a refusal to submit to the role of mistress. She denied the king's advances, over and over, with just enough heat to keep him obsessed. Anne knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted marriage, not dalliance, not motherhood by stealth. A crown, and Henry, famously, gave it to her. But not before detonating the foundations of England itself. Henry's pursuit of Anne forced the most seismic religious and political rupture in English history, the break with Rome. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry created his own church, installed himself as supreme head, and granted the divorce by royal decree. The process took 7 years, a national trauma of courts, councils, excommunications, and pamphlets. But by 1533, Anne and Henry were married. And that June, Anne was crowned queen. The coronation was symbolic overload, gold cloth, trumpets, pageantry. But beneath it all lay a message carved in ambition and risk. Anne was not just a wife. She was a revolution made flesh. Her crown represented a kingdom unmoored from Catholic Europe, a monarchy redefined, a church bent to royal will. And then came the pregnancy. This, more than anything else, had to work. Henry needed a son. England needed a son. The entire justification for the schism had been framed around dynastic continuity. And on September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter. The child, Elizabeth, was healthy, strong, and bright-eyed. But she was not a boy, and in a kingdom still poisoned by the memory of civil war, that mattered tremendously. Anne's position, once untouchable, began to wobble. Henry's affection cooled. The court turned. Catherine of Aragon, though pushed aside, remained a martyr in the eyes of many. Princess Mary, declared illegitimate, remained a rallying point for Catholic loyalists. And Anne, instead of solidifying the Tudor dynasty, had complicated it. Still, she remained queen. For now. The next 3 years were a slow descent from sovereign grace into something colder. Anne suffered multiple miscarriages, each one a dagger to the myth of her destiny. The court, always a shark tank, began circling. Jane Seymour, a quiet, modest lady-in-waiting, caught Henry's eye. She didn't argue. She didn't politic. She didn't protest. She simply waited. By early 1536, Catherine of Aragon was dead. That should have solidified Anne's hold on the throne. Instead, it removed the last reason for patience. With Catherine gone, Henry could marry again without theological gymnastics. On 29th of January 1536, Anne suffered her final, most devastating miscarriage, reportedly of a male child. The timing was catastrophic. The very same day, Jane Seymour was seen wearing the king's favor. The writing was no longer on the wall. It was being read aloud. But how do you remove a queen? Henry had already broken England in half to get her. Now he needed her gone, and not just annulled. He needed her discredited. removed so decisively that her memory couldn't return to haunt him, and so a case was built. The architect was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and bureaucratic juggernaut. Cromwell, once an ally of Anne's religious reformist circle, had fallen out with her politically. Their visions diverged. Anne wanted a Europe-aligned Protestantism. Cromwell preferred English pragmatism. More importantly, Cromwell needed control, and Anne was increasingly unpredictable. The charges brought against her in April 1536 were astonishing in scope and conspicuously implausible. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including Mark Smeaton, a court musician, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, Sir William Brereton, and, most scandalously, her own brother, George Boleyn. Adultery, for a queen, was treason. The logic was brutal. If the queen's children might not be the king's, then the succession itself was a lie. And lies like that tore kingdoms apart. But the real goal was annihilation, not a trial. A theatrical purge. The evidence was flimsy. The dates didn't align. Some of the alleged affairs took place when Anne was pregnant or not even present. Mark Smeaton, the only one to confess, likely did so under coercion. The others denied everything. It didn't matter. Anne was arrested on May 2, 1536 and taken to the Tower. She maintained her innocence to the end, even as the court around her shifted into execution mode. On 15th May, she was tried by a panel of peers that included her own uncle. She was found guilty. The sentence was death. Henry, in what passed for mercy, imported a French swordsman for the execution. Not the English axe. Something swifter, cleaner, less barbaric, if only symbolically. On the morning of 19th May, Anne walked to the scaffold. She wore a gray gown with a crimson kirtle beneath. Her hair was tied up, her headdress modest. She addressed the crowd briefly, without bitterness, without accusations. Her speech was measured, even gracious. She praised the king, asked for prayers, spoke like a woman who had already been erased from history. And then she was gone. The French swordsman did his work. The queen's body was placed in an arrow chest, not a coffin, and buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower walls. But the story didn't end in silence. Anne's execution was not just a royal punishment. It was a rewriting. Almost immediately the court began scrubbing her memory. Her badges were torn down, her initials erased, her servants reassigned. Within days, Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within weeks, he was married again. Within months, Jane was pregnant with the son Henry had always wanted. So had it all been a pretext? Almost certainly. Most modern historians agree that Anne was not guilty of the charges against her, that her fall was political, dynastic, and malevolent. A legal execution used to cleanse the court of an inconvenient queen. But what makes Anne's story resonate isn't just the injustice. It's the scope of what her life altered. She didn't just marry a king, she changed a country. The English Reformation, the rise of Parliament, the weakening of papal power, all flowed from the break Henry made to be with her. Anne was a queen of consequences, whether or not she ever meant to be. And then there's Elizabeth, the daughter Henry almost disavowed, who would one day become one of the greatest monarchs England ever knew. A woman whose rule redefined the very idea of what a queen could be. A daughter of Anne Boleyn, born in scandal, crowned in glory. In that sense, Anne won. Not in life, but in legacy. Her execution was meant to erase her. Instead, it immortalized her. But the axe wasn't done. Henry's hunger wasn't sated. The machinery of royal justice, once set in motion, didn't stop at queens. Because less than 3 years later, the Tower would again receive a noble prisoner with royal blood. A man whose title made him a peer, but whose lineage made him a target. Another cousin, another conspiracy, and another beheading. His name was Henry Courtenay, 1st Marquess of Exeter, and like Anne, He didn't fall for what he did, but for who he was. 8. Henry Courtenay, 1st Marquess of Exeter. In the grim theatre of Tudor executions, Henry Courtenay, 1st Marquess of Exeter, was not a leading man. He was no dazzling court favorite, no larger-than-life rebel in armor, no romanticized figure cut down in dramatic defiance. And yet, in 1538, he found himself dragged from the velvet chambers of royal privilege to the cold stone of Tower Hill. His crime was vague. The evidence, murky. The real reason, lineage. More precisely, proximity to a crown that had grown allergic to rivals. Courtenay's fall was not unique. It was archetypal. His story reads like a handbook for how to be executed in Henry VIII's England. Be born into Plantagenet blood, show too much independence, accumulate the wrong friendships, and exist in the exact moment when the monarch's paranoia outweighs his need for aristocratic loyalty. The result? Attainder, beheading, erasure. But before all that, Henry Courtenay was a man designed to survive. Born around 1498, he was the son of William Courtenay, Earl of Devon, and Catherine of York, the daughter of Edward IV. That gave him a solid Yorkist pedigree, with enough royal DNA to draw eyes but not enough to command armies. In another timeline, he might have lived a life of quiet privilege, high-born but harmless, like so many peers who learned to flatter first and speak second. Unfortunately for him, his cousin was Henry VIII. And Henry VIII didn't do harmless. Courtenay grew up in the royal household and was raised alongside the young king. The two Henrys, one a monarch by destiny, the other a noble by birth, were companions, courtly brothers in arms in their youth. In 1519, Henry VIII elevated Courtenay to the Privy Council and named him Marquess of Exeter. These were not symbolic honors. They were gestures of trust. For over a decade, Courtenay was a fixture at court, moving easily among the king's inner circle. He fought at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. He dined at the High Table. He danced at the court masques. He received land, titles, and commissions. But then came the 1530s. And if the 1520s were the decade of ascendancy for Henry VIII's closest allies, the 1530s were the decade of their destruction. Because in that decade, Henry didn't just change wives, he changed realities. The break with Rome wasn't merely a schism, it was an identity crisis. The crown, once rooted in religious tradition and noble lineage, now floated on the dangerous waters of personal power. Henry didn't just claim supremacy over the church. He claimed supremacy over history, over legitimacy, over God. This transformation didn't create a vacuum. It created a knife edge. The old nobility, especially those with royal ties, were now walking reminders of the way things used to work. And Courtenay, with his Yorkist blood and regional influence in the West Country, was exactly the kind of noble Henry began to see as surplus to requirements. But the fall wasn't instant. It never is. Courtenay's undoing came gradually, in whispers and fragments. Like so many others in this story, he was accused of participating in a conspiracy, the so-called Exeter Conspiracy of 1538. Historians still debate whether such a plot even existed. It may have been a fabrication, a pretext, a ghost conjured by political convenience. But in the Tudor court, evidence was a formality. If you had the wrong friends, the wrong ideas, or simply stood too close to the line of succession, you didn't need to act. You only needed to exist. The official narrative tied Courtenay to Reginald Pole, another Plantagenet descendant and a vociferous critic of Henry's religious reforms. Pole had refused to support the king's divorce, rejected the break with Rome, and spoken openly about restoring the old order. He had fled England and operated as a thorn in Henry's side from abroad, far out of reach, but never out of mind. Courtenay's great mistake, if he made one, was being connected to Pole by blood and sympathy. The two were cousins, both grandchildren of George, Duke of Clarence. That ancestral tie, combined with letters and hearsay, allowed Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and ideological bulldozer, to stitch together a treason case. The logic went something like this. If Pole wanted to challenge the king, and Courtenay was related to Pole, then Courtenay must be part of the challenge. It was guilt by genetic association. On November 4th, 1538, Courtenay was arrested. The charges were deliberately opaque. He was accused of compassing the king's death, a broad term under the Treasons Act that could encompass virtually anything, from plotting an assassination to muttering regrets over dinner. The real crime, as ever, was being conceivable as a replacement. Courtenay was a royal cousin, politically established and increasingly aligned with conservative nobles who opposed the king's more radical reforms. That was enough. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, subjected to interrogation, and denied a proper trial. Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against him, a legal mechanism that allowed the king to declare a subject guilty of treason without evidence or a hearing. It was, effectively, a law passed to kill a man. On December 9, 1538, Henry Courtenay was executed by beheading at Tower Hill. He did not resist. He did not confess. He met his end with the grim silence of someone who understood the performance. Executions under Henry VIII had ceased to be judicial acts. They were now theater, ritualized demonstrations of who ruled and who didn't. Courtenay's death wasn't meant to solve a problem. It was meant to broadcast a message. The old bloodlines had no future in this kingdom. So why did this execution matter? Not because Courtenay was a rebel leader, not because he posed an immediate threat, but because his fall revealed how absolutely the monarchy had changed. Where once kings feared the nobility and relied on them to legitimize their reigns, Henry had inverted the hierarchy. Nobles now feared the king. The aristocracy, once a balancing power, had become disposable. Even more chillingly, Courtenay's death marked the acceleration of a policy, the systematic removal of Plantagenet remnants. His execution was not an isolated act. It was part of a coordinated purge. In the months following his death, more heads would roll. His cousin Henry Pole, Lord Montague, was executed in January 1539. So too was Sir Edward Neville, a distant relative. The net was widening. Nobility itself had become a liability. And in the shadow of these executions stood a woman whose name had long evaded the axe. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, mother of Montague, cousin of Courtenay, daughter of Clarence, the last surviving legitimate Plantagenet of her generation. She had escaped the Tower so far. But for how long? The irony in Courtenay's execution is that it solved nothing. Henry VIII's insecurities only deepened. His circle of trusted advisors grew smaller. Cromwell, the man who orchestrated the conspiracy charges, would be executed himself just 2 years later. The court was becoming a snake pit with no exit, but Courtenay, unlike Cromwell or Anne Boleyn, left little behind. No heirs, no letters, no martyrdom. His death was tidy, unremarked, and almost eerily efficient. He was, in the end, forgotten, and that may have been the point. Because in the machinery of Tudor survival, the highest goal wasn't glory. It was invisibility. To be visible, noble, eloquent, connected, was to be at risk. And Courtenay, born to shine, was simply too visible to live. His death paved the way for further purges, further tightening of the monarchy's grip, and a growing realization that the Plantagenets were being unrooted one by one. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were possible. And that possibility terrified Henry more than any army ever could. Because what if the people remembered? What if they looked at Courtenay or Montague or Margaret Pole and saw not traitors but alternatives? What if the bloodlines they represented still carried weight, still whispered of a different kind of England, one where the king answered to something greater than himself? That could not be allowed. Which is why, 6 months later, Courtenay's cousin, Henry Pole, Lord Montague, would face the same fate. Another head, another scaffold, another ghost. And after him, Margaret Pole, mother of Montague, would be dragged to the Tower at last. The monarchy had already executed dukes, marquises, earls, and queens. Now it would execute an elderly countess, not for what she did, but for what she represented. And in doing so, it would show just how far the Tudors were willing to go, not just to win, but to erase. 9. Henry Pole, 1st Baron Montague. The Tudor regime did not believe in loose ends. It believed in pruning, methodically, selectively, and with finality. In the early winter of 1539, that philosophy took the shape of another royal scaffold, this time bearing the name of Henry Pole, 1st Baron Montague. Once a peer of the realm, once the polished image of Plantagenet loyalty turned Tudor pragmatist, Montague walked to the block at Tower Hill as a man condemned not by what he did, but by the shape of his blood and the memory of his house. If Henry Courtenay's execution earlier that year had been a warning, Montague's was a follow-through, proof that proximity to a once royal name was itself a capital offense. These were not executions aimed at rebellion, they were preemptive strikes, targeted purges against men who were dangerous because they could become symbols, even if they had not yet become traitors. But Henry Pole was more than a name. He was a nexus point, a bridge between the old dynasties and the new authoritarianism, a man who walked the razor's edge between noble ancestry and Tudor obedience until the court decided that even silence could be seditious. Born around 1492, Henry Pole was the son of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, and Sir Richard Pole. His mother, Margaret, was no fringe aristocrat. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, brother to both Edward IV and Richard III. In other words, she was Plantagenet royalty, a living relic of the house that ruled England before the Tudors carved out their place by force. Through her, Henry Pole inherited not just titles and estates, but lineage, the kind that made Tudor monarchs nervous. Still, he wasn't raised in open opposition. Quite the opposite. The Pole family had, at least outwardly, embraced Tudor rule. Margaret Pole had been a loyal servant under Henry VII and later Henry VIII, even serving as governess to Princess Mary. Her sons followed suit, finding their place within the system. Henry Pole himself was elevated to the House of Lords, made Baron Montague in 1514, and entrusted with various commissions and duties that kept him near the court, but never quite at its core. By all appearances, he was a safe noble, competent, loyal, and content to let his name rest rather than rise. But then came the 1530s. As Henry VIII's reign moved from stable monarchy to personal dominion, the rules changed. Nobles were no longer simply expected to be obedient. They were expected to be useful, flexible, and unquestioning. Montague's family, by contrast, began to look like a throwback to a vanished world, a court full of cousins and lords whose relevance was shaped by blood rather than proximity to the king's whims. And then there was Reginald Pole. Henry's younger brother, Reginald, was a scholar, a cardinal, and perhaps most problematically, a theologian with convictions. During the king's break with Rome, Reginald sided not with his sovereign, but with the Pope. He wrote tracts against Henry's divorce, decried the king's supremacy over the church, and became a public and international critic of the English Reformation. He did not, notably, return to England, but his family stayed behind, and so they became, by extension, a hostage class, living reminders to the king that his reforms were not universally embraced, and that bloodlines still carried allegiances the crown could not command. Henry Pole tried to walk the line. He distanced himself from Reginald's writings. He maintained a presence at court. He did not speak out. But silence, in Henry's England, was not neutrality. It was ambiguity. And ambiguity was treason adjacent. The pretext for Montague's arrest came in late 1538, as part of the same Exeter conspiracy sweep that had already claimed Courtenay. Allegedly, a network of nobles sympathetic to Catholicism, or at least hostile to the king's new order, were corresponding with Reginald Pole abroad. Montague was named as part of the conspiracy, as was his brother, Geoffrey Pole, and his mother Margaret. How much truth was there? That question still haunts historians. Some evidence suggests Geoffrey may have cracked under pressure and implicated Henry to save himself. Other reports suggest that intercepted letters, circumstantial statements, and pure speculation were enough for Thomas Cromwell, the king's ever-efficient minister, to build a case. The fact that Montague's trial was never a true trial, but rather a predetermined spectacle, points to politics, not justice. On November 4, 1538, Montague was arrested and taken to the Tower. Unlike Reginald, he had not written tracts. He had not advocated rebellion. He had not raised an army. But he had a last name, and in a court increasingly ruled by suspicion and legacy management, that was sufficient. By early December, he was attainted, declared guilty of treason by Act of Parliament without a trial. His titles were stripped, his lands confiscated. His name publicly blackened. On January 9, 1539, he was beheaded at Tower Hill. Like so many others in this era, Montague's death was wrapped in legal fiction and rhetorical flourish. The court framed it as a necessary act of security, a blow against sedition, a stand for royal sovereignty. But the people who watched knew better. They knew this was a man who had not rebelled, who had not conspired in any meaningful sense. They knew this was a man undone by family, not action. His brother's exile, his mother's lineage, his own silence. In Tudor England, these were not accidents. They were culpabilities. So why did Henry VIII fear him? Because Henry Pole was proof that bloodlines don't forget. That despite all the acts of attainder and religious pivots, the Plantagenet memory lingered. And unlike the louder Yorkist claimants, those who had challenged kings with armies, Montague represented something subtler, the loyal alternative. The possibility of a royal nobleman who didn't fight but simply stood as a reminder of a different kind of past. That kind of presence was insidious. It made people think, made them remember, made them compare. And when your legitimacy rests on decades of political narrative, the last thing you want is a walking counter-narrative. So he was removed. Montague's death was not an anomaly. It was a confirmation. The king was not simply eliminating enemies. He was editing the realm, and the edit was not yet complete. Because even as Montague's body was removed from the scaffold, his mother remained in the Tower. Margaret Pole, now in her 60s, had long served in the royal household, had kept her counsel, had bent every which way the wind blew. But she too carried the fatal inheritance, Clarence's blood, the last surviving daughter of a duke who had once stood second in line to the throne. A woman whose sons had all been destroyed, but whose name still whispered resistance in its mere pronunciation. Margaret would remain in the Tower for over 2 years, imprisoned, interrogated, and ultimately condemned without trial. Her death would be messier, more visibly unjust, but it would follow the same blueprint as her son's. Eliminate the memory, break the line. And with Montague gone, the Countess's fate was not just sealed, it was scripted. The execution of Henry Pole, then, was not just about security. It was about erasure. By 1539, Henry VIII had begun to govern not as a king among nobles, but as a king above nobility. The old rules, where dukes and lords had a say, where family alliances held sway, had crumbled. In their place stood a monarch who viewed every independent lineage as a potential revolt in slow motion. The memory of Plantagenet legitimacy haunted the Tudors like a phantom limb. They had lopped off the body, but they could still feel it twitch. And so, one by one, they cut deeper. Courtenay, Montague, Neville. The names fell like dominoes, and behind them, silence. Because that was the goal, not just to kill, but to stop the talking, to end the speculation, to close the chapter so decisively that no one would dare reopen it. But history has a sense of irony, and sometimes the effort to silence a name is the very thing that immortalizes it. Today, Henry Pole is not remembered for rebellion. He is remembered for being remembered, for dying not because he tried to change history, but because he refused to escape it. And the shadow he left behind? It bore the shape of his mother, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, now alone, aging, and waiting in the Tower. Her crime? Survival. Her sentence? Already written. Because kings may kill lords, but mothers remember. And in the court of Henry VIII, even memory could be punished. 10. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. When the axe fell on Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, on 27th May 1541, it did not merely sever the life of a woman. It attempted to sever a memory, a lineage, a whisper that would not be quiet, a threat not because of sword or army, but because her existence told a story the crown wanted buried. She was 67 years old, a widow, a mother of 5, once governess to a princess, once one of the most respected noblewomen in the kingdom, and above all, she was the last living legitimate Plantagenet, the final thread connecting Tudor England to the vanished world of York and Lancaster. That made her, in the eyes of Henry VIII, not a relic, not a matriarch, but a problem that hadn't been solved yet. And Tudor England had a solution for problems. It dressed them in treason, marched them to the Tower, and erased them with a signature. But Margaret's story didn't begin in a dungeon. It began in a cradle of legitimacy, so legitimate, in fact, that few in her generation matched her pedigree. She was born in 1473, daughter of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, and Isabel Neville, the daughter of the kingmaker himself, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. On her father's side, she was niece to Edward IV and Richard III. On her mother's side, the most powerful nobleman of the Wars of the Roses. Her bloodline was so thick with royalty it practically glittered. In another life, she might have been queen herself. In the one she lived, she learned early that royal blood is often an invitation to disaster. When Margaret was just 3 years old, her father, George, Duke of Clarence, was executed for treason by order of his own brother, Edward IV. The charge was conspiracy. The cause was politics. The consequence was permanent. Clarence's attainder meant his children were stripped of titles, lands, and inheritance. Margaret and her brother Edward, later Earl of Warwick, were raised not as noble heirs but as unwanted echoes of a family that was already cannibalizing itself. She survived that first fall. Barely. When the Tudors took the crown in 1485, Henry VII, eager to stabilize a realm exhausted by dynastic whiplash, chose to re-include Margaret into polite society. Not fully, not loudly, but enough to keep her quiet. She married Sir Richard Pole, a loyal but low-profile courtier with Lancastrian sympathies. It was a strategic match. It kept her close, married her into the king's camp, and effectively muted her Plantagenet threat. Or so it seemed. Margaret bore children, managed her household, served faithfully. Her most prominent child, Reginald Pole, was groomed for the church, becoming a scholar of repute and a rising star in Rome. For a while it worked. Margaret Pole was respected, responsible, and above all, quiet. But Tudor England had no taste for history that lingered. In 1509, Henry VIII ascended the throne, young, athletic, popular. He married Catherine of Aragon and inherited a kingdom that had, for the first time in decades, stopped bleeding. Margaret was restored to the peerage as Countess of Salisbury in her own right. She regained some of her family lands. She was appointed governess to Princess Mary. She was back at the royal court, this time not as a dangerous orphan of a traitor, but as a loyal aristocrat of the realm. But power in Henry VIII's hands was not a stable commodity. It was an orbiting sun, and those too close risked incineration. By the 1530s, the king's world was fracturing. His marriage to Catherine collapsed under the weight of political desperation. No male heir, no papal annulment, no patience. Henry broke from the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and married Anne Boleyn. Those who didn't clap loud enough were suddenly enemies of the state. Margaret found herself in a moral labyrinth. Her loyalty was torn between her duties at court and her personal convictions. She had served Catherine of Aragon. She had raised Mary. Her son Reginald publicly condemned Henry's break from Rome, denouncing the king's self-coronation as head of the church and calling the entire Tudor project spiritually bankrupt. Reginald didn't just oppose Henry, he embarrassed him. In speeches, in tracts, and most pointedly, in his cardinal's robes, he became the spiritual voice of Catholic Europe against English heresy. To Henry, it was betrayal. To Rome, it was martyrdom in waiting. The problem? Reginald was safe abroad. So Henry looked inward. He could not reach the son. But the mother? She was right there. And she was still a Plantagenet. In 1538, the government orchestrated what became known as the Exeter Conspiracy, a loosely defined plot said to involve a number of high-born nobles, including Henry Courtenay, Henry Pole, and their extended kin. The details were vague, the charges flimsy, but the targets were precise. Anyone with Yorkist or Plantagenet blood, who might, just might, provide a rallying point for rebellion. Margaret was arrested on the 4th of November 1538 and taken to the Tower. No trial, no hearing, no opportunity to speak. An act of attainder declared her guilty of treason based on her son's writings, her lineage, and a few intercepted letters that spoke more to religious devotion than armed conspiracy. Her lands were seized, her household dissolved, her name blackened. But her execution? That would have to wait. For more than 2 years, Margaret languished in the Tower, untried, uncharged, legally condemned but practically suspended. Her cell was sparse. Her contact with the outside world was minimal. She was old, isolated, and deeply aware that the shadow of the axe hovered above her at all times. Why the delay? Historians debate it. Some suggest Henry was hesitant, unsure how the execution of an elderly woman, once royal, once beloved, might play abroad. Others argue he simply didn't need to act yet. Her presence in the Tower was punishment enough. But by 1541, tensions were rising again. Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, had just been arrested. The mood was anxious. The king was increasingly paranoid. And in May, he decided that Margaret's usefulness as a hostage had expired. The warrant was signed, the scaffold prepared. On 27th May, without prior notice, the constable of the Tower informed Margaret that her sentence was to be carried out immediately. She had no time to prepare, no time to speak. She was led to the courtyard within the Tower grounds, away from public view, perhaps in a faint gesture of mercy. What happened next is a matter of grim legend. Because she was unprepared, perhaps even unaware that the moment had come, she was said to resist. Not violently, not frantically, but with confusion, with the stunned defiance of someone being erased for a crime they never committed. The executioner was inexperienced. The blow was not clean. Witnesses later claimed that multiple strokes were required, but those are details. And details in Tudor history are often embroidered. What matters is that the Countess of Salisbury was dead. The last of the Clarence line. The last woman of York. The final direct link to the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for more than 3 centuries. And she was killed not for rebellion, not for treason, but for the shape of her name and the sound of her blood. So why did Henry VIII really execute Margaret Pole? Because Margaret was a symbol he couldn't control. She hadn't raised an army. She hadn't plotted with foreign powers. She hadn't declared for Rome. But her name, her very presence, was a challenge, a reminder that before Henry rewrote the rules of kingship, there were other names, other claims, other ways the crown might have landed, and she was not quiet about it. Even in the Tower, even in disgrace, Margaret reportedly maintained her dignity. She refused to confess, refused to name names, refused to believe that her son's theology had made her life forfeit. In that silence, Henry heard a threat. He could not debate her. He could not defeat her, so he deleted her. But deletion does not always work the way tyrants expect. In death, Margaret Pole became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of injustice. In 1886, she was beatified by the Catholic Church, declared a martyr. Today, she is remembered not as a conspirator, but as a woman who outlived her dynasty and died for her DNA. Her execution marked a final chapter in the Tudor campaign to purge the past. The great names of York and Plantagenet had been extinguished. Clarence, Courtenay, Montague, Warwick, all gone. The message was clear. The crown was not a family legacy anymore. It was a possession. And only one family would possess it, for now. Because history, as Margaret knew too well, has a way of circling back. And while Henry was busy cleansing the court, elevating and destroying queens and reducing the peerage to yes-men, he forgot one essential truth. Tyrants never sleep easy, and they don't love twice. Because the next royal execution wouldn't be a cousin, or a cardinal's brother, or a dowager countess. It would be his queen. Again. 11. Catherine Howard. The second queen to lose her head was not, like Anne Boleyn, a reformer. She had no theological agenda, no father in the Privy Council, no crown-straining legacy of miscarriage and disappointment. Catherine Howard had no ambitions beyond being adored. She did not want to rule. She wanted to belong. But in Tudor England, that was enough to kill you. When Catherine was executed on the 13th of February 1542, just 9 months after her cousin Anne's memory had been quietly extinguished in court ceremony and public silence, it wasn't the past that condemned her, it was the past she carried with her. And in a court addicted to paranoia, reconstruction, and the spectacle of moral enforcement, being young, beautiful, and insufficiently cautious could be a capital offense. Catherine was likely born around 1523 to Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son of the Howard dynasty. The Howards were one of the oldest and most formidable noble houses in England, ambitious, calculating, and often one misstep from disaster. Her father, however, was not the dynasty's brightest flame. He was poor, unlucky, and largely sidelined from court. Catherine's mother died when she was young, and she was placed in the care of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. If this sounds like the beginning of a fairy tale, it wasn't. The Dowager Duchess ran what was effectively a semi-autonomous finishing school for female nobility and minor gentry. Her household was full, chaotic, and under-supervised. Teenage girls, hormone-loaded noble sons, visiting tutors. It was a powder keg of opportunity, carelessness, and dangerous intimacy. Catherine's upbringing in this environment would come back to haunt her. Not because she did anything unusual, but because in Henry VIII's England, memory could be criminalized. In her teenage years, Catherine had flirtations, possibly relationships, with several men, including her music tutor Henry Mannix and later Francis Dereham, a man who acted as something between suitor and self-appointed fiancé. Whether these interactions were consensual, coercive, romantic, or pragmatic, history still debates. But they happened, and more importantly, people remembered. Still, none of this seemed to matter in 1540, when Catherine suddenly found herself at the center of royal attention. Henry VIII, then in his late 40s, was on the rebound. His fourth marriage, a politically motivated union with Anne of Cleves, had collapsed spectacularly after 6 months. The king had declared the marriage unconsummated and sought an annulment, an unprecedented royal embarrassment that required immediate cosmetic repair. Catherine Howard, young, charming, and dazzling in the court masks, became the answer. She was at most 17 years old. Henry was nearing 50, increasingly unwell and physically deteriorating. But the court hailed it as a love story. She was the rose without a thorn, a nickname both poetic and pointed. Henry was smitten, genuinely, perhaps desperately. She was made Queen of England just weeks after his divorce from Anne of Cleves, and for a brief theatrical moment, it looked as if youth itself had rescued the crown from ridicule. But there were cracks. Henry's court was no longer merely a political arena. It had become a surveillance state. Ministers, factions, spies, and informers orbited the king like satellites. The Privy Council, particularly under the watchful eye of Thomas Cranmer, was not interested in romance. It was interested in stability, power consolidation, and moral correctness, at least the kind that kept the machinery of state oiled. And Catherine Howard, barely out of girlhood, surrounded by ambitious relatives, and increasingly isolated in her gilded cage, wasn't playing carefully enough. Soon after her marriage, she reportedly began an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber and a man of high courtly standing. Their interactions were noted by her attendants, especially her lady-in-waiting Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Yes, the same Lady Rochford whose testimony had once helped destroy her sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn. Whether the relationship with Culpeper was physical or not is still debated. What is not debated is that meetings happened, letters were exchanged, and her former acquaintance, Francis Derham, had been appointed to her household, likely at her request. Derham's presence alone was a catastrophic oversight. To Catherine, he may have represented familiarity or loyalty. To the council, he was evidence. By late 1541, rumors reached Cranmer. The investigation began quietly. Then, not so quietly. Cranmer confronted the Queen with a letter. She denied everything. He pressed. She panicked. Eventually, under pressure, she confessed to past liaisons before her marriage, denying anything improper afterward. Derham was arrested. So was Culpeper. So was Lady Rochford. Testimonies were extracted, some willing, some coerced. Catherine was stripped of her queenship on the 23rd of November, 1541. She was confined to her chambers, then transferred to Sion Abbey, and finally to the Tower of London in early February. Her title was never legally rescinded. She died a queen, though not in dignity. Her execution was ordered not by judicial trial, but by Act of Attainder, passed in Parliament in February 1542. It accused her of treason, not for what she had done before marriage, but for what she had allegedly done during it, compromising the integrity of the royal bloodline, creating doubts about the legitimacy of heirs, and insulting the dignity of the crown. In this framing, adultery wasn't just sin, it was sedition. On the morning of 13th February, Catherine was led to the scaffold within the Tower grounds. The story goes, though it may be apocryphal, that she asked for the executioner's block the night before to practice placing her head. A chilling detail, if true, a literary flourish, if not. In her final words, she allegedly declared that she died a queen and died the wife of the king, perhaps her one remaining defense. And then she was gone. She was about 19 years old. But what killed Catherine Howard? Not adultery, not really. Her execution was not an act of justice. It was an act of royal hygiene, a regime cleaning itself of its own embarrassment. Henry VIII had made her queen with breathtaking haste. He had flaunted her youth as a balm for his own decline. Her fall was not just personal, it was political. If she was guilty, he had been deceived. If she was innocent, he had been impulsive. The Tudor image machine could not accommodate such contradictions. And so, her guilt had to be total. Her fall had to be absolute. Only that would preserve the king's narrative. But Catherine's death was also the logical outcome of a monarchy where legitimacy was a performance, and women were props in a dynastic theater. Queens were not consorts, they were tools to produce heirs, to bolster alliances, and stabilize regimes. When they failed, they were discarded. Catherine failed because she was too young, too poorly advised, and too deeply embedded in a court where every past mistake became a future crime. And let's not forget the politics beneath the surface. The Howard family, Catherine's extended clan, was powerful, Protestant-leaning, and increasingly viewed with suspicion by rival factions. Her execution weakened them, just as Anne Boleyn's had weakened theirs before. In Tudor England, royal marriages were power plays, and queens were often checkmates waiting to happen. Catherine's death signaled that no one was untouchable. That age, rank, and even royal intimacy offered no protection when the state required a scapegoat. And Henry? He did not attend the execution. He never saw her again after November. Instead, he retreated into mourning, or at least public performance of it. For all his 6 marriages, Henry never remarried with the same reckless speed again. His next queen, Catherine Parr, would be a very different figure, mature, cautious, intellectual. Chosen not for beauty or fertility, but for stability. The king had learned something. Perhaps. But the cost had been another young woman's life, another public death, another stain on a crown already darkened by blood. Yet Catherine's execution marked something else as well, a shift in perception. Anne Boleyn had been executed amid theological revolution. Catherine Howard was executed for personal shame. The crown was no longer just a political institution. It was now a moral one, wielding legal tools not only to govern subjects, but to punish intimacy. It wasn't just queens who had to watch themselves now. It was everyone. What you did before marriage, who you loved, who remembered it, and who was in the room when it mattered. In that sense, Catherine died not as a cautionary tale, but as a precedent. She was the reason future queens would be vetted like treaties, watched like ambassadors, remembered not as wives but risks. And yet history gave her something Henry never did, a name that endured, a voice that, however faint, reminds us that courts are machines, and those caught in their gears are often ground down not for defiance, but for miscalculation. Her final words may have been scripted, or true, or somewhere in between, but they echo all the same. I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper. What she meant by that, whether it was love, regret, or resignation, we'll never truly know. But we do know what came next, because Henry, ever the pattern maker, was not finished purging the memory of inconvenient queens. But even his machinery would take a breath. For now, the next royal execution would not be a wife. It would be a queen in name only, a girl crowned for 9 days, a rival monarch created by ambition, discarded by politics, and remembered by history. Her name was Lady Jane Grey, and her death would not simply echo Anne and Catherine. It would bring back the ghost of dynastic civil war itself. 12. Lady Jane Grey. There's a certain grim poetry in being remembered for the number of days you wore a crown. Not years, not reigns, not victories. Days. For Lady Jane Grey, the most tragic monarch England ever produced, that number was 9. She was queen in name, in proclamation, and in legal fiction, but not in power, not in choice, not in will. And for her reluctant brush with monarchy, she would be led to the block on February 12, 1554, sacrificed not for what she did, but for what she represented, the terrifying potential of legitimacy in the wrong hands. Jane was not born to rule. She was born to prove someone else could. She entered the world in 1537, into a political powder keg still smoldering from Henry VIII's divorce from Rome, the executions of 2 queens, and the bloody consolidation of the Tudor dynasty. Her father, Henry Grey, was the Duke of Suffolk. Her mother, Frances Brandon, was the daughter of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. That made Jane the great-niece of the king, royal enough to matter, but not royal enough to choose her own fate. Her lineage placed her fourth in line for the throne by Henry's 1544 Act of Succession, behind Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. But in a country that equated stability with male succession and legitimacy with religious conformity, her claim, however thin, would one day become a weapon. Jane's early years were marked by all the standard fixtures of noble Protestant education: humanist tutors, strict discipline, classical languages, and a heavy dose of Reformed theology. She was a precocious student, fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew. A serious child, shaped more by scholarship than courtly games. One tutor described her as having a sharp wit, excellent memory, and ready tongue. Another noted her stoic piety, her patience, her belief that this life was merely the waiting room for the next. She would need all of that stoicism, because when King Edward VI, Henry VIII's long-awaited male heir, began to fail in 1553 at just 15 years old, the kingdom's Protestant experiment teetered on the edge of ruin. Edward had been raised under the firm hand of Protestant reformers, his reign overseen by protectors and regents. His death meant not only a succession crisis, but a religious reckoning, because the next heir by law was Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, a Catholic and a public one at that. To the Protestant elite that had grown fat and powerful during Edward's reign, Mary was not a rightful queen. She was a restoration, a rolling back of reforms, a danger to property, to doctrine, to the very identity they'd stitched into the Church of England. They had seen what Catholic monarchies looked like in Europe. They didn't want it in London. Enter Jane. She was young, barely 16, intelligent, female, yes, but malleable, Protestant to the marrow, and best of all, married. In May 1553, she was wed to Lord Guilford Dudley, the son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man in Edward's England and the architect of the plan to place Jane on the throne. It was, from beginning to end, a power play. Northumberland hoped to secure control over the realm by marrying his son to a queen of his own making. Edward, dying and increasingly desperate to preserve the Protestant project, was persuaded to alter the line of succession. In a document known as the Devise for the Succession, he bypassed his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, naming Jane as his heir. The legal footing was questionable, the timing suspicious. But when Edward died on the 6th of July, 1553, the machinery moved quickly. On the 10th of July, Jane was proclaimed Queen of England. She didn't celebrate. Historical accounts agree that she was stunned by the news. Some say she fainted. Others that she wept. She allegedly refused the crown at first, only relenting under pressure from her parents and in-laws. This wasn't the ambition of Anne Boleyn or the political cunning of Elizabeth. Jane was installed, like furniture. But England was not a house that could be redecorated quietly. Mary, upon hearing of Edward's death and Jane's proclamation, rallied her supporters. Within 9 days, Mary had gathered enough political and military support to march on London. The nobility, sensing the shift in winds, defected en masse. The Privy Council reversed course. Jane, who had never left the Tower, then still the traditional residence for monarchs awaiting coronation, was arrested. On July 19th, Mary entered London to cheering crowds. Jane's reign ended before it began. And here is where the tragedy sharpens. Because Mary, at first, did not want to execute Jane. She knew the girl was a pawn, a figurehead, a minor who had been used by ambitious men. Mary's early decisions were merciful. Jane was imprisoned but treated with relative kindness. Her husband, Guilford Dudley, was also spared. There was hope, real hope, that Jane would be allowed to fade into obscurity, live quietly, and perhaps even be forgotten. But fate, in Tudor England, rarely honored mercy. In early 1554, the kingdom convulsed again. A rebellion broke out in Kent, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, a Protestant nobleman furious over Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain, a staunch Catholic and future king of a vast European empire. The marriage was seen as an existential threat to English sovereignty and Protestant identity. The rebellion was quickly crushed. But in the chaos, Jane's father, Henry Grey, joined the plot. That was the end. The court could no longer ignore the symbolic weight Jane carried. She had been queen, legally, however briefly. She had royal blood. She had a name. And even from the Tower, she had become a rallying point for Protestant defiance. Mary, pressured by her council, by Philip's advisors, and by the implications of leniency, signed the death warrant. Jane was told on the 8th of February that she would be executed in 4 days. She met the news with composed sadness. Not shock, not protest, just the quiet resignation of someone who had never truly belonged in this game and who, at last, understood that it was over. On February 12, 1554, Jane watched as her husband was led from the Tower to his execution. His body was returned in a cart. She did not see it, but she must have heard the commotion. Then it was her turn. She was led to the scaffold on Tower Green, the same site where Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard had died. It was a private execution, witnessed by a small, curated audience. She wore a black gown, a black cape, and a white headdress. She spoke briefly, declaring herself guilty only of accepting the crown without proper deliberation. She held fast to her Protestant faith. As she prepared herself for the end, she blindfolded herself and groped for the block. In her final words she whispered, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." She was 16 years old. So why was Jane Grey executed? Not for treason, not really. Not even for rebellion. She was executed because she had become a question that England was too afraid to answer. A Protestant queen in a Catholic monarchy. A teenager who had once held the throne, however briefly. A name whispered in uprisings. A body housed in the same stone prison where real traitors plotted and real monarchs fell. Her existence made Mary's legitimacy look fragile. Her death made Mary look strong. But it came at a cost. Jane's execution shocked even loyalists. Her youth, her piety, her reluctance. It was all too visible, too human. She wasn't a schemer. She wasn't Anne Boleyn with her reformist fire, or Catherine Howard with her reckless courtly charm. Jane was innocent, and everyone knew it. And that's what made her dangerous. She could have been a symbol of resistance, a Protestant martyr, a living reminder of the brief moment when the kingdom's religion, its elite, and its succession laws had aligned behind someone else. And so she was removed. But not forgotten. Within years, Protestant writers began mythologizing her. She was no longer a failed queen, but a Protestant saint, her learning and devotion highlighted, her final moments immortalized in paintings and sermons. In the Elizabethan age, she became an icon, the girl who had died for the Reformation. Even in the centuries that followed, Jane Grey remained a figure both tragic and emblematic. She was what the Reformation might have looked like if it had been gentler, and what monarchy might have been if it had been kinder. But Jane's execution also marked something else, the end of a certain kind of royal ideal. She was the last monarch in English history to be executed by a sitting monarch. Others would die. Others would rebel. But never again would a crowned queen be tried, condemned, and executed by a successor who wore the same crown. From here, executions would once again tilt upward, to challengers, conspirators, and cousins. And one of those cousins? A queen in her own right, a rival sovereign, a Catholic threat to a Protestant regime. Because decades after Jane fell, another queen would enter England in chains. She would be tried not for rebellion, but for being too royal, too legitimate, too alive. Her name was Mary, Queen of Scots. And her death would redefine what it meant to kill a queen, not for who she had been, but for who she might still become. 13. Mary, Queen of Scots. They called her a queen from the moment she drew breath. Not metaphorically, not in the hopeful, wistful way one says of a noble child born into a minor household, but literally. Mary Stuart, born in December 1542, became Queen of Scotland 6 days later, following the death of her father, James V. She was anointed, crowned, and swaddled in velvet before she could walk. And from that moment forward, her life became a crucible of politics, pageantry, and pressure. But her death, on the 8th of February 1587, executed at Fotheringhay Castle, was not about Scotland. It wasn't even about her reign. It was about what she represented: a rival monarchy, a Catholic icon, a legitimate heir in the eyes of half of Europe. A woman whose royal presence was so threatening to Elizabeth I that her heart stopped trusting her long before her sword was ever drawn. Mary, Queen of Scots, died because she existed, not because she acted, not because she ruled, but because she refused to stop being a queen in a world that only had room for one. Her childhood was a chess game with no child-sized pieces. Raised in the protective custody of the French court, Mary was more Bourbon than Stuart by the time she came of age. Educated in Paris, immersed in Renaissance culture, she was groomed not as a minor monarch from the chilly north, but as a European princess destined for dynastic greatness. Her marriage to Francis, Dauphin of France, in 1558, briefly made her queen consort of France, and when he ascended to the throne a year later, she became the most powerful woman in Europe at just 16. But fate, always crueler to crowned heads than to commoners, had other plans. Francis died in 1560, and Mary, now a widow at 18, returned to the kingdom she'd technically ruled for nearly 2 decades but barely knew. Scotland, by then, was a fractured country, splintered by religion, war, and suspicion. Mary re-entered her homeland like a candle in a thunderstorm. Elegant, Catholic, foreign-educated, all of it set her apart in a realm now increasingly gripped by Protestant reformers. Her cousin, Elizabeth I, had recently ascended to the English throne after a long, bloody saga of legitimacy, marriage shifts, and religious schisms. Mary was not just a queen, she was an alternative. According to Catholic doctrine, Elizabeth was illegitimate, the product of an unlawful union between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Mary, as the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, had the stronger claim in Rome's eyes. To Catholic Europe, she wasn't just Queen of Scotland. She was the rightful Queen of England. It was a fact she never quite denied, and one Elizabeth never quite forgave. Back in Scotland, Mary tried to rule. Truly she did. She attended council meetings. She issued proclamations. She attempted religious tolerance, trying to knit together a realm divided by creed. But her rule was stalked by scandal almost from the start. First came her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in 1565. He was handsome, charming, and catastrophically unstable. Ambitious beyond reason, jealous to the point of violence, and politically toxic. Their union was a disaster. Darnley's role in the murder of Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, in front of the pregnant queen shocked even the hardened factions of the Scottish court. Then, in 1567, Darnley himself was murdered, his house blown up, his body found strangled in the garden. The culprit? Still unknown. But suspicion fell heavily on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a man Mary would marry just weeks later. Whether the marriage was the result of love, coercion, or political strategy remains hotly debated. What's clear is that it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The nobility revolted. Mary was imprisoned, then forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. By 1568, she had escaped Scotland entirely, fleeing south to England, to Elizabeth, to the cousin she had never met. It was a bold move, perhaps a desperate one. Mary likely hoped for sanctuary, for recognition, even restoration. But she did not understand Elizabeth's court. She did not grasp that the English crown had evolved into something colder, more bureaucratic, more survivalist than the continent's monarchies. Elizabeth didn't see Mary as a family obligation or a political ally. She saw her as a live grenade, and so began a confinement that would last 19 years. Not a prison exactly, but not freedom either. Mary was shuffled from manor to castle, always under watch, always under suspicion. The conditions were polite at first, befitting a queen. She had her own quarters, servants, and access to correspondence. But she was never allowed real privacy, never permitted to travel, and never ever allowed to leave. Because Elizabeth understood the truth. As long as Mary lived, she was a threat. Not because she was plotting, though plots came with and without her knowledge, but because her mere existence provided legitimacy to anyone who wished to delegitimize Elizabeth. Catholic powers abroad, Spain, the papacy, parts of France, saw in Mary the rallying point for rebellion. English Catholics, marginalized and surveilled, whispered her name as they passed recusant mass behind locked doors. So why not execute her? Because executing a queen was a seismic act. Elizabeth had avoided it for years. Killing Mary wasn't just killing a woman. It was decapitating a concept. That monarchy was ordained by God, that blood was sacred, that queens were immune from ordinary justice. Elizabeth knew this. She knew that killing Mary could invite retaliation, domestic unrest, even war. So she waited. For years. Until the Babington Plot. In 1586, English intelligence, under Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, intercepted a series of encrypted letters. A Catholic nobleman, Anthony Babington, was corresponding with Mary. He planned to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. The plot was real. The conspiracy was serious. And Mary's involvement? Legally damning. Walsingham had agents embedded in Mary's household. He intercepted the letters, decrypted them, and, crucially, allowed them to continue. There is still debate over whether Mary fully grasped what she was responding to. Her letters were cautious, oblique, but one reply sealed her fate. She wrote that if the plan succeeded, she would accept the crown. It was enough. Mary was arrested, again. This time not as a guest, but as a traitor. She was tried in October 1586 by a panel of 40 noblemen and lawyers. She denied the charges, denied the authority of the court, and reminded them all that she was an anointed sovereign, not an English subject. They found her guilty. Still, Elizabeth hesitated. She signed the death warrant. Then she wavered. Then she revoked it. Then reissued it. Finally, in early February 1587, a council faction took matters into their own hands and carried out the sentence. Whether this was done with or without Elizabeth's full intention is a matter of historical debate. But by the time she could object, the deed was done. Mary was told of her execution on the 7th of February. She prepared meticulously. On the morning of the 8th of February, she dressed in crimson, a color associated with Catholic martyrdom. She carried a crucifix. She walked to the execution chamber at Fotheringhay Castle with poise. She forgave her executioner. She knelt. She prayed. Her final words reportedly invoked Jesus and forgiveness. And then the axe fell. But her story didn't end there. Because Mary, Queen of Scots, was never just a person. She was an idea, a possibility, a parallel history. Her execution shook Europe. Spain, already furious with Elizabeth over religious policies and privateering raids, escalated their plans for invasion. The Spanish Armada, launched a year later, was not caused by Mary's death, but her execution gave it moral fuel. At home, Catholics were horrified. Some wept, some seethed. Even Elizabeth's Protestant supporters whispered about the implications. If a queen could be tried and executed like a common criminal, what did monarchy even mean anymore? Elizabeth herself claimed the execution was unauthorized. She blamed her ministers. She expressed outrage, perhaps sincere, perhaps performative. But the damage was done. The unthinkable had happened. One monarch had ordered the death of another. A precedent had been set, and it would haunt England for generations. So why did Mary have to die? Because her claim wouldn't die. Because she would not renounce her right. Because Catholic Europe would not stop whispering her name. Because the English throne, in all its Reformation-era fragility, could not tolerate alternative scripts. Mary's life was a constant tension between legitimacy and liability. She was too royal to ignore, too dangerous to embrace, and too visible to forget. For 19 years she had lived in the shadow of a cousin who saw in her both a mirror and a warning. And when the balance of power tipped, it tipped with an axe. Mary's death was not merely political. It was philosophical. It was about the theology of monarchy. Whether sovereigns could be judged, whether queens could be punished, whether divine right could be voided by national interest. Her execution broke that taboo. And once broken, it would not be repaired. Years later, another monarch, Charles I, would be tried and executed, not as a tyrant, but as a man. The charge would echo Mary's, that he had conspired against the people, against the state, that his authority was conditional, not absolute. And so the blade would fall again, not in secret, not in castle shadow, but in the cold light of public spectacle outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The next royal execution would not be a queen accused of plot. It would be a king accused of war. A monarch who ruled not by ambition, but by assumption, and for that, England would cut down its own sovereign. 14. Charles I. On a bitter January morning in 1649, a wooden scaffold stood in front of the banqueting house in Whitehall. It was framed by a blank winter sky and lined with men who claimed authority not from blood, nor God, but from Parliament. In the crowd below, silence tightened around the square like a vice, for this was no ordinary execution. This was not the end of a rebel or a traitor or even a foreign queen. This was the end of a king, a man who had believed with every fiber of his divine education that kings did not answer to subjects. And yet, Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, found himself answering for everything. What died that day wasn't just a man, or even a monarchy. It was a theology, a centuries-old superstition dressed in velvet and Latin, that kings were chosen by heaven, and that the crown was more than a symbol. It was inviolable sovereignty. Until suddenly, it wasn't. The blade that fell on 30 January 1649 didn't just sever a dynasty. It decapitated an entire idea. But as with most revolutions, it didn't start with the ending. It started with a budget. Charles was born in 1600, the second son of James VI of Scotland, who in 1603 became James I of England after the death of Elizabeth I. The union of the English and Scottish crowns should have birthed a new political harmony, but instead it introduced a new strain of dynastic tension. The Stuarts, fiercely convinced of divine right, collided with a kingdom that had grown increasingly wary of kings who acted like gods. When Charles's elder brother, Henry Frederick, died young, Charles became heir to a throne already simmering with ideological unrest. He ascended in 1625, earnest, bookish, and painfully introverted, traits which might have suited a quiet bishop but proved disastrous in a king. Where Elizabeth had mastered the art of royal theater and James had deployed rhetoric like a shield, Charles mistook silence for majesty. He believed deeply, dangerously, in the divine right of kings, that his authority came not from Parliament or the people or law, but from God alone, and that belief would shape every conflict of his reign. From the beginning, Charles was politically allergic to compromise. He inherited a financially stressed crown and immediately exacerbated the problem by marrying Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess, alienating his Protestant subjects and Parliament alike. Worse still, he seemed to treat Parliament as a ceremonial nuisance, not a constitutional partner. When MPS refused to grant him funds without oversight, Charles dissolved Parliament. Then he dissolved the next one. By 1629, he had dismissed it altogether and embarked on what would be known as the personal rule. 11 years of autocratic governance without parliamentary approval. He raised revenue through controversial means. Ship money, a medieval tax repurposed for peacetime, forced loans, fines, and monopolies. Each scheme felt more desperate than the last. To his subjects, it was tyranny dressed in legal parchment. But money was only half the war. The other was religion. Charles's reign coincided with a broader European storm of Reformation backlash and counter-Reformation anxiety. He aligned himself with Archbishop Laud, a high church Anglican who emphasized ceremony, hierarchy, and beauty, qualities that smacked of Catholicism to England's growing Puritan population. His imposition of the Book of Common Prayer on Presbyterian Scotland in 1637 ignited the bishops' wars, a rebellion against religious interference that forced Charles to recall Parliament for funds, a fatal decision. In 1640, he summoned what would become the Long Parliament, but instead of obedience, he was met with resistance. Parliament used the opportunity to demand reforms, impeach royal advisers, and assert its own authority. Charles, cornered, attempted the unthinkable. He entered the House of Commons in person, accompanied by soldiers seeking to arrest 5 MPs. It failed. The members had been warned and fled. That moment, the king standing in the Commons chamber, his authority rebuked, was irreversible. Trust between monarch and parliament evaporated. England split in two. The English Civil War broke out in 1642. On one side stood the royalists, supporters of the king, the aristocracy, the tradition of monarchy. On the other stood the parliamentarians, a coalition of Puritans, gentry, merchants, and military pragmatists who wanted either to reform or replace the monarchy. What began as a constitutional crisis became a blood-stained trial of national identity. Charles, despite being the nominal commander of his forces, was no military genius. He placed his trust in aristocratic commanders and lost key territories early. Meanwhile, Parliament built the new model army, a professional, ideologically committed fighting force led by men like Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. By 1646, Charles was defeated. He surrendered to the Scots, believing they would treat him better than his own Parliament. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Scots turned him over to the English. Here the narrative begins to blur with contradiction. Even after defeat, Charles continued to negotiate, or rather, to manipulate. He made conflicting promises to different factions, hoping to divide them. He played Parliament against the army, England against Scotland, moderates against radicals. But the longer he maneuvered, the more he convinced his enemies that he could never be trusted. In 1647, he escaped captivity and reignited conflict. This second civil war was shorter, bloodier, and left even moderates disgusted. By now, the army, especially Cromwell's faction, believed Charles was not just misguided, but malignant. They called it the man of blood problem. Could a king who had caused so much war, betrayal, and suffering be allowed to live? The answer, for the first time in English history, was number. In December 1648, the army forcibly purged Parliament of moderates, creating the Rump Parliament, composed entirely of those willing to put the king on trial. The High Court of Justice was formed, an extraordinary, legally dubious tribunal. Its authority was novel, even fictional. It had no precedent, but it had purpose. Charles refused to recognize its legitimacy. He said a king could not be tried by his subjects. The court disagreed. The trial was public. Testimony was given. The charge was stark, that Charles had traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people. He was found guilty. The sentence was death. The reaction across England and Europe was shock. Even many who opposed Charles politically were uneasy about the execution of a sovereign. Royalty had been deposed before, imprisoned, even assassinated. But to be tried and executed by law, this was new. It was modern and terrifying. Charles spent his final days in St. James's Palace, praying, writing letters, preparing himself for martyrdom. In many ways, he welcomed it. He believed his death would prove the righteousness of his cause, that he would become a political saint for monarchy. He wasn't wrong. On 30 January 1649, he walked from St. James's through St. James's Park, flanked by guards, to the banqueting house. A window had been removed. Outside, a scaffold waited. Accounts say he was calm, that he addressed the crowd as a man who had been wronged by his subjects, that he forgave those responsible, that he prayed, that he signaled he was ready. The axe fell. And then, nothing. No immediate restoration, no sudden collapse of Parliament. The monarchy was abolished. The House of Lords disbanded. England became, for the first and only time in its history, a republic. The Commonwealth of England, led first by Parliament and later by Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. But it didn't last. The republic proved unstable. It lacked legitimacy, consensus, and continuity. Cromwell ruled until his death in 1658. His son, Richard, was weak. By 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, son of the executed king. The restoration was triumphant, but it carried a scar, because even as Charles II reclaimed his father's throne, the specter of 1649 loomed. No king ever ruled quite the same again. So why did Charles I die? Not because he was hated. He had supporters. Martyrs rarely die friendless. Not because he lost a war. Others had lost wars before and survived. He died because he refused to adapt. Because he believed, even in defeat, that kings were above the law, that negotiations were beneath him, that God had crowned him, and that was enough. But England had changed. The people had changed. And the revolution that began as a budget dispute ended with a theology overturned. Charles's execution was a hinge in time, a moment when divine right yielded to something colder, harder, more modern, constitutional authority. Even though monarchy returned, it never returned untouched. The precedent remained, like a sword hanging above every crown. No future English or British monarch would ever again claim absolute rule. And while Charles's name was eventually restored in royalist memory, his feast day, his martyr cult, it didn't undo the revolution. It merely masked the wound. But the curtain didn't fall with Charles. Because while England would never again execute its own monarch, it would still silence royal rebellion. Cousins and claimants would still rise. And in one final gasp of dynastic drama, a rebel with royal blood, born illegitimate but burning with ambition, would challenge the crown in his own name. His rebellion would fail. His execution would be the last of its kind. He was James Scott, Duke of Monmouth. And he would die not because he was too royal, but because he was just royal enough to frighten a king. 15. James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth. Some men die for power they never had. Others die for power they believe is rightfully theirs. And a rare few die for power they were never supposed to even dream of. Yet dream they do, louder and longer than the world can tolerate. James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, was such a man. He was the kind of royal relative that monarchies don't know what to do with. Close enough to be a threat, illegitimate enough to be expendable, and charismatic enough to be dangerous. He looked like a king in a restoration world obsessed with appearances, carried himself like a prince in a court that thrived on performance, and ultimately tried to be sovereign in a kingdom that already had one. His execution in 1685 was not just the last state-sanctioned death of a royal claimant in English history. It was the final thundering echo of an older mode of monarchy, a system still haunted by bloodlines and whispered legitimacy, still able to convince itself that birth alone might redeem a rebellion. But Monmouth's death would prove otherwise. By the end, royal blood was no longer enough to save a man from the axe. His fatal miscalculation wasn't in rising up. It was in thinking that being royal, even unofficially, still carried immunity. James Scott was born in 1649, the same year his grandfather Charles I was executed. The monarchy had just been abolished, the republic had just been declared, and in a twist of timing only history can orchestrate, this child entered a world without a crown, destined to one day challenge the very concept of monarchy he was born into. He was the illegitimate son of Charles II and Lucy Walter, a Welsh noblewoman with a famously precarious reputation. Charles never married Lucy, and the boy, born James Crofts, was never formally legitimized. But he was acknowledged. Raised partly in the household of a royalist noble, educated abroad, given the best of martial training and courtly manners, this was not the upbringing of a forgotten bastard. This was someone being prepared. For what? That remained uncertain. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Charles II returned to the throne. He had no legitimate heirs. His queen, Catherine of Braganza, bore him no children, and though Charles fathered a staggering number of acknowledged illegitimate sons, some estimates count over a dozen, Monmouth was the favorite. Handsome, charming, athletic, and politically adept, at least early on, he became Duke of Monmouth in 1663, married an heiress, and rose to lead royal armies in various conflicts, including the Anglo-Dutch Wars and the suppression of internal unrest. By the late 1670s, Monmouth had become more than just a court favorite. He was a Protestant symbol, a beacon to those who feared what was coming next. Because next in line after Charles was his brother, James, Duke of York. And James was openly, unambiguously Catholic. The 1670s and early 1680s were politically combustible years in England. After the trauma of civil war, regicide, and republicanism, the country had restored its monarchy, but it had not restored its appetite for absolutism or Catholicism. The two were often seen as twins. One demanded obedience, the other allegiance to a foreign pope. English Protestants viewed the combination as an existential threat. The exclusion crisis of 1679 to 1681 was an attempt to block the Catholic James, Duke of York, from succeeding Charles II. Many saw Monmouth as the perfect alternative, a Protestant, a popular figure, and, in the fevered imaginations of some, perhaps even secretly legitimate. There were rumors, always unproven, always denied by the king, that Charles had married Lucy Walter in secret. If true, it would mean Monmouth was a rightful heir. If false, it would mean the man was a usurper in waiting. The ambiguity became part of his political brand. He never claimed the title of prince outright, but he also never renounced it. He gave just enough room for others to believe on his behalf. Charles, for his part, maintained a delicate balancing act. He loved Monmouth, perhaps more than any of his other children, but he also believed in order. He refused to publicly legitimize the boy, refused to alter the succession. The crown, in his eyes, belonged to James, despite religion, despite fear, despite everything. When Charles died in February 1685, the transition was fast and uncontested. James, Duke of York, became James II. Monmouth, who had been exiled to the Netherlands after being implicated in previous conspiracies, waited for the moment when fear, hope, and ambition might align. That moment came just 4 months later. The Monmouth Rebellion was as much a psychological gambit as a military one. Monmouth landed at Lyme Regis on the 11th of June 1685 with a small force, mostly Dutch and a handful of English exiles. He claimed he came to free England from a Catholic usurper. He claimed to be fighting for Protestant liberties. And then, in a stroke of boldness that would define his entire campaign, he declared himself king. He styled himself as James II, even as his uncle occupied that throne. The rebellion gained some support, mostly from the rural and religiously anxious West Country. But Monmouth's army was ill-equipped, ill-trained, and ultimately outmatched. He tried to march on Bristol, failed. Tried to gather more men, failed. He issued proclamations, held impassioned speeches, wrote letters calling on Protestants to rise. But the enthusiasm never reached the level he needed. The final confrontation came at Sedgemoor, on the 6th of July, 1685. Monmouth's forces were crushed by the King's army, led by John Churchill, future Duke of Marlborough. The rebellion collapsed. Monmouth fled, disguised, alone. He was captured within days, hiding in a ditch, covered in brambles. Even in defeat, he carried himself with flair. He asked for mercy, begged for his life reportedly, wrote letters to James II pleading for a pardon. His pleas were ignored. The king had no interest in pardoning a man who had claimed his crown. And perhaps more importantly, he had no interest in allowing rebellion by royal relatives to appear negotiable. Monmouth was taken to the Tower of London. He was tried and condemned for treason, though the trial itself was largely symbolic. His fate had already been decided. On July 15, 1685, he was executed at Tower Hill, the last time a close royal relative would meet such a fate by order of the English state. His death was public, his final words carefully recorded, his story widely reported, and while his rebellion had failed, his symbolism endured. To some, he was a romantic figure, the golden-haired Protestant prince who dared to defy a Catholic monarch. To others, he was a deluded pretender who endangered the realm. But to history, he was something more specific, the final casualty of dynastic politics as a blood sport. Because, here's the paradox, Monmouth died trying to assert that blood still mattered. That lineage, even illegitimate, could be political currency. That the natural order of monarchy included space for the bold, the beloved, the popular. That a man's parentage could still inspire armies. But the world had changed. James II, for all his flaws, represented a new kind of monarchy, more bureaucratic, more systematized, more legalistic. His succession, unlike the chaos of the Wars of the Roses or the convulsions of the Tudor court, had come peacefully. To accept Monmouth's claim was to invite a return to the old days, of civil war, faction, and fluid legitimacy. The English state, increasingly shaped by the logic of centralization, chose stability over sentiment. Monmouth's death marked the end of the idea that royal proximity alone could justify rebellion. In an age now dominated by political parties, religious policy, and parliamentary power, his attempt to be a people's prince was both out of time and out of place. And yet his death didn't secure the Stuart dynasty. If anything, it accelerated its fall. James II reigned only 3 years longer. His autocratic style, his overt Catholicism, and the birth of a Catholic heir in 1688 triggered what became known as the Glorious Revolution. Parliament, fearing the establishment of a Catholic dynasty, invited James's Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, to take the throne. They accepted. James fled. There was no execution, no civil war, just a quiet, carefully arranged transfer of power, a revolution not of blood, but of ideology. From that moment forward, no English or British monarch would be executed again. The monarchy itself became conditional, subject to Parliament, boxed in by constitutional limits. James Scott's death, in a strange way, was a final offering to that transition, a last reluctant sacrifice to a history that would no longer tolerate dynastic violence as normal politics. So what did Monmouth's execution really signify? It wasn't just the end of his rebellion. It was the end of a type of royal story, the idea that a crown could be seized by charm, by gall, by warlike speeches and symbolic bloodlines. He was the last of a genre, the handsome bastard prince with just enough ancestry to dream dangerously. After him, monarchy would be transformed from a game of inheritance and execution into something quieter, duller, and infinitely more survivable. And so ends the line of English royal executions. From princes betrayed by their own parliament to queens made scapegoats for their husbands' policies, to cousins framed as conspirators, to sovereigns cut down by revolutionary courts. The pattern was always the same. Blood made them royal, but politics made them disposable. And when politics changes, even royal blood can dry up into dust. But if you think that was the end of royal danger, think again, because while the scaffold was retired, the shadows remained. There were whispers, pretenders, exiles, plots that never quite reached the blade, but still left marks. Because monarchy, for all its performance, never quite stops trembling at the idea that one day someone just royal enough will return. And if not with an army, then maybe with a story.